A 13-year-old girl taped a single crumpled dollar bill to the gas tank of the most dangerous man in Arizona. And that dollar started a war that no one in this town saw coming. Tonight, a grandmother sits alone on a porch soaked in gasoline. The men who put it there are waiting for sundown. The police already turned away, the neighbors already locked their doors, and the only thing standing between an old woman and a house fire is a child who has nothing left. Nothing except $1 and a rumor that somewhere out in the desert, a pack of scarred, broken bikers still protect people the world has forgotten. But what Ivy Rayner doesn't know yet is that the man she's about to ask for help hasn't protected anyone since the night he buried his own daughter. If you stay until the end of this one, I promise you, this story will stay with you long after the engines go quiet. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and let's ride. Part 1. The rain started around 6 and never let up. It came down sideways across the Arizona flatlands, turning the highway into a black river that reflected nothing but the occasional sweep of headlights from trucks hauling freight south toward Tucson. Route 9 was the kind of road people used to leave places, not arrive at them. The towns along it were afterthoughts, clusters of gas stations and faded storefronts held together by habit and not much else. Hardin was one of those towns, population 1,200 on a good year, less than that tonight. The Iron Saints clubhouse sat at the far edge of Hardin, just past the rail crossing where the tracks hadn't carried a train in 11 years. From the outside, it looked like what it was, a converted auto garage with a flat roof and steel-reinforced walls, the original bay doors welded shut and replaced with a single heavy entrance marked by a hand-painted sign that read, Iron Saints MC, established 1987. The neon from the sign bled red and white across the wet parking lot where a row of Harleys sat cooling in the rain, chrome catching light like the eyes of sleeping animals. Next door, connected by a cracked walkway and a shared dumpster, was a diner called May's. It had no website, no hours posted on the door. It opened when May felt like opening it and closed when the last biker left. Tonight it was open because tonight was Wednesday, and Wednesdays meant church. Not the kind with hymns and pews, but the kind where scarred men sat around a long table in the back booth and talked about money, territory, and who owed what to whom. The diner smelled like burnt coffee, bacon grease, and the particular kind of silence that happens when dangerous men are thinking. There were 9 of them tonight. 9 members of the Iron Saints sitting beneath buzzing fluorescent lights that turned everyone's skin the color of old paper. Cigarette smoke drifted in lazy blue ribbons toward the water-stained ceiling. Leather creaked when someone shifted weight. A fork scraped across a plate. Outside, thunder moved across the desert like furniture being dragged across a floor somewhere far above. At the head of the table sat Graves Mercer. He was 53 years old and looked like 60 had already come knocking and been told to wait. His beard was silver at the edges, darker where it grew close to his jaw, and his hands were the kind of hands that had done things he no longer talked about. Thick-knuckled, scarred across the backs, with a faded tattoo of a small sparrow on his left ring finger, where a wedding band used to be. He wore a plain black t-shirt beneath his cut, and the leather vest itself was so old and road-beaten it had taken on the texture of something organic, like bark or dried skin. Graves didn't speak much during church. He listened. He watched the way men held their beer bottles, tight or loose. He watched their eyes, whether they looked at him when they talked or looked at the table. He'd learned a long time ago that the truth lives in the things people do when they think nobody's paying attention. Tonight, the table was discussing a problem with a meth operation running product through the county using the old rail corridor. It wasn't their product. It wasn't their operation. But it was their county, and the last time outside poison had moved through Hardin unchecked, a 15-year-old kid had ended up dead in a drainage ditch behind the high school. That was 4 years ago. Graves had been the one to find the body. He never told anyone what the boy's face looked like, but he hadn't slept through a full night since. "We hit the corridor Thursday night," said Deacon, the club's VP, a wiry man with a shaved head and a prosthetic left hand he'd earned in Fallujah. "Torch the stash house. Send a message." "What kind of message?" Graves said. It wasn't a question. Deacon paused. "The kind that doesn't need words." Graves looked at him for a long moment, then looked down at his coffee. The surface was still. black. He could see the fluorescent light reflected in it like a small cold sun. "Thursday," he said. That was the end of the discussion. When Graves said a word once, it was a decision. When he said nothing at all, it was a bigger one. The men around the table had learned the grammar of his silence years ago. They drank their beer, they smoked. Outside, the rain kept falling. Nobody noticed the girl. She had been standing across the street for 40 minutes, pressed against the side of a boarded-up laundromat, watching the diner through the rain. She was small enough that in the dark, from a distance, she could have been mistaken for a shadow or a trash bag caught against the wall. She wore a gray hoodie 3 sizes too large, the sleeves rolled up and still hanging past her wrists, and jeans that were wet from the knees down. Her sneakers had holes in both toes. Her hair was dark and plastered to her face, and her eyes, wide, brown, unblinking, had the look of an animal that has been running and has finally stopped. Not because it found safety, but because it ran out of places to go. Her name was Ivy Rayner. She was 13 years old, and in her left hand she held a crumpled dollar bill so tightly that the paper had gone soft with sweat and rain. In her right hand she held a note she had written on the back of a grocery receipt 40 minutes earlier, sitting on the floor of a gas station bathroom 2 miles down the highway because it was the only place with a working pen chained to the counter. She had walked those 2 miles in the rain, alone, at night, on a highway with no sidewalk and no streetlights, and trucks blowing past close enough to pull at her hoodie with their wind shear. She had done this because there was no one else left to ask. Ivy crossed the street. The parking lot was dark except for the neon and the yellow square of light from the diner window. She could see the bikers inside. They looked exactly like what everyone in town said they were. Rough, scarred, the kind of men that mothers pointed at and said, "Stay away." One of them had a facial scar that ran from his eyebrow to his jaw. Another had hands so tattooed they looked like they were wearing gloves made of ink. The big one at the head of the table, the one with the silver beard, looked like he could break a man's arm without changing expression. Ivy's legs were shaking, not just from cold. She crouched behind the dumpster between the diner and the clubhouse and looked at the row of motorcycles. She didn't know which one belonged to the president. She didn't even know what a motorcycle club president was exactly. All she knew was what old Hector at the salvage yard had told her that afternoon when she'd gone to him begging for help, and he'd turned her away like everyone else. "Only people in this town who still got teeth are the saints," Hector had said, not looking at her. "But you don't go to men like that, girl. You don't knock on that door." "Why not?" "Because once you knock, you can't unknock. You understand? Whatever happens after, you asked for it." Ivy had understood. She had also understood that by midnight her grandmother's house would be on fire, and the woman who had raised her since she was 4 years old would be inside it. So she knocked. Not on the door. She didn't have the courage for that. Instead, she took the crumpled dollar and the note and she taped them, with a piece of electrical tape she'd found on the ground, to the gas tank of the biggest Harley in the row. It was black and chrome with scratches along the engine guard and a small faded sticker on the rear fender that read, "Ride or Remember." She didn't know it was Graves' bike. She just figured the biggest bike belonged to the biggest man, and the biggest man was probably in charge. Then she stepped back into the shadow behind the dumpster, pressed herself against the cold brick wall, and waited. She waited for 17 minutes. She counted every one of them by the rhythm of her own heartbeat, because she had no phone and no watch and no way to tell time except by the feeling of it dragging across her skin like sandpaper. At 9:47 p.m., the diner door opened, boots on wet asphalt, the heavy clink of keys, a lighter clicking open and shut, voices, low, rumbling, the kind of voices that came from chests instead of throats. The bikers were leaving church. They moved toward their bikes in 2s and 3s, zipping jackets, pulling on gloves, tilting their heads back to let the rain hit their faces like men who had long ago stopped caring about comfort. Graves was the last one out. He walked with a slight limp in his right leg, an old injury, something deep in the knee that acted up in cold weather. He didn't hurry through the rain. He moved through it the way he moved through everything, steady, unhurried, like a man who had already survived the worst thing that would ever happen to him and saw no reason to rush toward anything that came after. He reached his bike. He pulled his gloves from his back pocket. And then he saw it. The dollar bill. the note, taped to his gas tank with crooked electrical tape. He peeled it off carefully, like it might be fragile, and held it close to the neon light so he could read the handwriting. It was messy, shaky, written by a hand that was either very young or very scared, or both. It said, "Please don't let them burn my grandma alive tonight. This is all I have. I'm sorry it's not more." Graves read it twice. Then he stood completely still for a long time, the rain falling on his shoulders and running down his leather-cut and dark rivers. The other bikers were mounting up around him, engines starting to crack and rumble, but Graves didn't move. He just stood there holding the dollar bill and the note like a man who had just been handed something heavier than paper. Deacon noticed first. He killed his engine and swung off his bike. "Graves." No answer. "Graves, what is it?" Graves handed him the note without a word. Deacon read it. His jaw tightened. He looked up, scanning the dark parking lot with the sharp focus of a man who spent 2 tours scanning rooftops in Ramadi. "Where'd this come from?" Graves didn't answer. He turned his head slowly, looking toward the dumpster, toward the dark gap between the diner wall and the brick. He didn't move. He just waited. Because Graves Mercer understood something about fear that most people don't. He understood that when a scared thing comes to you, you don't walk toward it. You stay still. You make yourself quiet. You let it choose when to step into the light. 8 seconds passed. Then a small, soaking wet figure emerged from the shadow, behind the dumpster, shaking so hard, her sneakers squeaked against the asphalt. Ivy looked up at the bikers. They looked down at her. Nobody said anything. The rain filled the silence like static. Graves lowered himself to one knee. The joint popped loud enough to hear. He held the dollar bill carefully between his thumb and forefinger, treating it the way another man might treat a contract signed in blood. "You paid," he said. His voice was low, rough, and very quiet. "That means you hired us." Ivy's chin trembled. "It's only $1. "Doesn't matter what it is," Graves said. "What matters is you brought everything you had. That's more than most people ever do." He stood. The knee popped again. He looked at Deacon, then at the rest of the saints, who had by now killed their engines and were standing beside their bikes in the rain, watching, waiting. "Saddle up," Graves said. Nobody asked where they were going. Nobody asked why. 9 men climbed onto 9 motorcycles and started 9 engines that shattered the silence of the desert night like a crack in the earth's surface. But Ivy wasn't riding a motorcycle. She was 13 and weighed maybe 90 pounds soaking wet, which she was. Graves walked her to the club truck, a battered black Chevy with a camper shell, and opened the passenger door. "Get in." She hesitated. The cab smelled like gasoline, old tobacco, and leather conditioner. There was a faded photograph taped to the dashboard. A little girl, maybe 5 or 6, sitting on the front of a motorcycle and laughing. Ivy didn't look at it long because Graves reached past her and flipped it face down before she could. He pulled his own road jacket, a heavy, oil-stained leather coat with the club's patch on the back, from behind the seat and draped it over her shoulders. It swallowed her. The sleeves hung past her knees. It weighed more than her backpack. "Buckle up," he said, and shut the door. Ivy sat in the dark cab of the truck, wrapped in leather that smelled like decades of highway and engine heat, and for the first time in 72 hours, she felt her heartbeat begin to slow. She didn't know who these men were. Not really. She didn't know that Graves had a daughter once. She didn't know that the photograph on the dashboard was all he had left of her. She didn't know that 3 years ago he'd gotten a phone call at 2 a.m. and driven to a hospital in Phoenix and walked into a room where a machine was breathing for a 6-year-old girl who would never wake up, and that he'd sat beside that bed for 9 days until the doctors told him there was nothing left to sit beside. She didn't know that when he'd read her note, "Please don't let them burn my grandma alive tonight," something inside him had shifted like a tectonic plate moving beneath a decade of grief, and that the reason he'd stood so still in the parking lot was because he was not deciding whether to help her. He was deciding whether his hands, which had failed to protect the one person who mattered most, had any right to try again. He decided they did. Not because he believed he deserved a second chance, but because the girl with the dollar bill didn't deserve to pay for his failures. The convoy moved through Hardin like a funeral procession with teeth. 9 Harleys in a staggered V formation, headlights cutting white tunnels through the rain, with the black Chevy truck bringing up the rear. The sound was enormous, a rolling thunder that rattled windows in houses 3 blocks away, that made dogs bark and porch lights flicker on, and old men look out from behind curtains with expressions that were half fear and half something older and harder to name. They rode east, toward the edge of town where the houses got smaller and the lots got bigger and the streetlights stopped pretending to work. Ivy gave directions through the truck's CB radio that Graves had handed her before he mounted up, her voice thin and crackling through the static. Left on Mesa, then straight for a mile. It's the yellow house with the chain-link fence. She said it flat, like she was giving directions to a pizza delivery. But her hand, the one not holding the radio, was gripping the seatbelt strap so hard her knuckles had gone white as bone. In the truck bed behind her there were tools. Not weapons. Tools. Hammers. A box of nails. 2x4s. A first aid kit. A fire extinguisher. The Iron Saints were not riding to Evelyn Rayner's house to start a war. They were riding there to stop one. But they had also been to enough wars to know that sometimes stopping one and starting one look exactly the same from the outside. The yellow house appeared at the end of Mesa Road like something out of a half-remembered dream. It was small, 2 bedrooms, a bathroom with a window that didn't close all the way, a kitchen where the linoleum was peeling up in the corners, and a front porch that Evelyn Rayner had painted blue 14 years ago because her husband Ray said blue porches kept wasps away. Ray was wrong about the wasps. He was also dead. Heart attack in the driveway 6 years back, falling face first into a wheelbarrow full of weeds. But the porch was still blue. Tonight, it was also wet with gasoline. Ivy smelled it before she saw anything. It came through the truck's vents, sharp, chemical, wrong. The kind of smell that doesn't belong near someone's home. The kind of smell that means someone has already made a decision that can't be taken back. She grabbed the radio. "They're already there," she said, and her voice cracked for the first time. "Please, they're already there." At the front of the convoy, Graves heard the crack in her voice. He opened his throttle. Behind him, 8 other throttles opened in unison, and the convoy surged forward like a held breath finally released. What Graves saw when the headlights hit the yellow house would stay with him for the rest of his life. It would join the other images that lived in the space behind his eyes. The hospital room, the machine, the small hand going cold, and it would sit there like a photograph he could never put face down on a dashboard. There were 4 men on the property. 2 of them were on the porch, one holding an empty gas can, and the other holding a second can that was still sloshing. A third stood in the yard near a white pickup truck with no plates, smoking a cigarette and watching the road. The 4th was on the side of the house, pouring gasoline along the base of the wall near the bedroom window. And on the porch, sitting in a rocking chair because she either couldn't stand or had decided standing wasn't worth the effort, was Evelyn Rayner. She was 71 years old. She weighed 110 pounds. She wore a house coat with yellow flowers on it and slippers that had been new sometime during the last presidency. Her hands were in her lap, folded over each other, and they were trembling. Not with fear exactly, but with the particular vibration of a body that has been afraid for so long it doesn't know how to stop. Her eyes were open. She was looking at the men around her. She was not screaming. She was not begging. She had done both of those things already, hours ago, when the first truck had pulled up and the men had gotten out with their cans and their smirks and told her she had until sundown to leave. She had begged then. She had called the police, and a tired dispatcher had told her they'd send someone when they could. No one came. She had knocked on her neighbor's door, and Margaret, who she'd known for 30 years, had looked at her through the chain lock and said, "I'm sorry, Evie, I can't get involved." So Evelyn had gone back inside. She had washed her dishes. She had folded a load of laundry. She had watered the plant on the kitchen windowsill, a small cactus Ivy had given her for Mother's Day 2 years ago. And then she had gone to the porch and sat down in a rocking chair and waited, because when you are 71 and alone and the world has decided you don't matter enough to save, the only thing left is the dignity of sitting still. Then the street began to shake. The first thing the men on the property heard was the sound. It came from the east, from the direction of town, and it started as a low vibration that you felt in your chest before you heard it in your ears. Then it grew. It built like a wave, like the approaching roar of something massive and mechanical and alive. The windows of the yellow house began to rattle. The gasoline on the porch trembled in small concentric circles. Headlights appeared at the end of Mesa Road. Not one. Not two. 9. 9 headlights in a staggered formation, cutting through the rain and the darkness, like the eyes of something that had been sleeping and was now very much awake. The man with the cigarette in the yard dropped it. He didn't drop it because he was scared. Not yet. He dropped it because his hand forgot how to work. The 9 Harleys came down Mesa Road at 40 miles an hour. Not fast, not slow. The speed of men who want you to see them coming and want you to have just enough time to understand what's about to happen, but not enough time to do anything about it. They pulled onto the street in front of the yellow house and killed their engines one by one, and the silence that followed was somehow louder than the noise that preceded it. 9 men sat on 9 bikes in the rain, faces half lit by the porch light, and they did not move. They did not speak. They just sat there, boots on wet asphalt, leather glistening, and they looked at the 4 men on the property with the calm, patient focus of wolves who have all night. Graves was the first one off his bike. He swung his leg over slowly, favoring the bad knee, and planted both boots on the ground with a sound like something being settled permanently. He didn't reach for anything. He didn't clench his fists. He just walked toward the gate of the chain-link fence with his hands at his sides, and every step he took landed heavy enough to feel through the ground. The man in the yard, the one who'd dropped his cigarette, moved to block the gate. He was big, not as big as Graves, but big enough to think it mattered. He had a neck tattoo and a shaved head and the kind of jaw that said he'd been in fights before and won most of them. "This is private property," the man said. "You need to turn your bikes around." Graves stopped at the gate. He looked at the man the way you look at a road sign you're about to pass. "You've got gasoline on a 70-year-old woman's porch," Graves said. "You want to talk to me about property? I don't know who you think you are, old man, but I'm the man she hired." Graves nodded toward the truck, where Ivy was watching through the windshield, her face pale and small behind the rain-streaked glass. "She paid me $1. I'm here to do the job." The man in the yard laughed. It was a short, nervous laugh, the kind that comes out when the body needs to do something and can't decide between fighting and running. He chose wrong. He reached for Graves' collar. It was a fast move, practiced, the kind of grab and pull that starts bar fights and ends them just as quick. His hand got within 6 inches of Graves' chest before something happened that the other 3 men would later describe differently, depending on how many drinks they'd had. What happened was this. Graves caught the man's wrist with his left hand, twisted it outward, and stepped to the side in a single motion so smooth and economical it didn't look like violence. It looked like a door opening. The man's own momentum carried him forward and down, and Graves helped him the rest of the way with a knee to the solar plexus that emptied his lungs like a bellows. The man went to his knees on the wet grass, gasping, and Graves released his wrist and stepped over him without looking down. He walked through the gate. He walked up the path. He walked up the 3 porch steps, past the 2 men with gas cans who were now standing very still, and he stopped in front of Evelyn Reiner. The old woman looked up at him. She saw the leather cut, the scars, the patch on his chest that read President, the silver in his beard and the cold steadiness in his eyes. There was not cruelty but something adjacent to it, something that lived next door to cruelty and shared a wall but never the same room. "Ma'am," Graves said, "your granddaughter sent us. You're safe now." Evelyn's lower lip trembled once, just once. Then she pressed her lips together and nodded, and her eyes filled with something that was not quite tears and not quite relief, but the specific look of a person who had given up and then been ungiven up for. Behind Graves, Deacon and 2 other saints, a massive Samoan named Koa and a quiet, thin man called Wire, who did the club's electronics, walked onto the property. They didn't go to the porch. They went to the 4 men. Koa positioned himself near the truck with no plates, arms folded, the rain running down his shaved head and across shoulders that looked like they'd been designed for exactly this kind of night. Wire circled around the side of the house to find the 4th man, the one who'd been pouring gasoline along the bedroom wall. That man was gone. A trail of wet footprints led into the vacant lot behind the property, disappearing into the dark. Wire followed them to the fence line, then stopped. He clicked his radio twice. The signal for fled, not worth pursuing. But the other three were still here, and so was whatever had sent them. "Who hired you?" Graves said, turning from Evelyn to face the two men on the porch. He said it the same way he'd said Thursday in the diner. One flat statement that didn't leave room for the word no. The men looked at each other. They were hired labor, the kind of men who took cash for ugly jobs and didn't ask whose signature was on the check. One of them was maybe 25, with a thin beard and eyes that were already calculating the distance to the street. The other was older, harder, with a scar through his upper lip and the dead stare of someone who'd stopped feeling bad about things a long time ago. It was the older one who answered. "You don't want this fight, brother." Graves looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached into his back pocket and pulled out the crumpled dollar bill. He held it up between two fingers, letting the porch light catch it. "See this? A 13-year-old girl walked 2 miles through the rain to give me this. She taped it to my bike because she didn't have the courage to knock on the door. She didn't have the courage because the whole world already told her nobody was coming. The cops told her. The neighbors told her. Every adult in this town looked at a child begging for help and said, 'Not my problem.'" He stepped closer to the man with the scar, close enough to smell the gasoline on his hands. "I'm not your brother," Graves said, "and I'm not asking again. Who hired you?" The man with the scar swallowed. His eyes flicked past Graves to the street, where 8 bikers sat motionless on their Harleys, like a jury that had already reached its verdict. "Grinnell," the man said. "Wade Grinnell. He's the developer. He wants the whole block cleared by end of the month. This was the last holdout." Graves nodded slowly. He folded the dollar bill and put it back in his pocket. "Get off this property. Leave the truck. Leave the cans. Walk." "The truck's not—" "Walk." They walked. All 3 of them. The 2 from the porch, and the one still on his knees in the yard, walked down Mesa Road into the rain and the dark, and nobody followed them, and nobody watched them go. They were already irrelevant. They were tools. Graves wanted the hand that swung them. Wade Grinnell. The name sat in his mind like a splinter. He turned back to Evelyn. The old woman hadn't moved from her rocking chair. The gasoline smell was thick enough to taste. "Ma'am, we need to get you off this porch. The fumes aren't safe." Evelyn shook her head. "I'm not leaving my house." "Nobody's asking you to leave your house. I'm asking you to sit inside while we clean this up." She looked at him. Really looked. The way old people look at you when they're trying to see the shape of your intentions through the surface of your face. Whatever she saw must have been enough, because she reached for the arms of the rocker and began to push herself up. Graves extended his hand. She took it. Her fingers were thin and cold and held on tighter than he expected. He walked her inside. The kitchen light was on. The dishes were done. A small cactus sat on the windowsill, and beside it, a child's drawing held to the fridge with a magnet. Stick figures, a yellow house, a sun with a smiley face. Graves looked at the drawing for 1 second too long. Then he looked away. "Koa," he called out the front door. "Hose down the porch, all of it. Wire, check the foundation line. Make sure nothing's soaking into the crawl space." The work began. Outside, the black Chevy truck's door opened, and Ivy Rayner stepped into the rain wearing Graves' road jacket like a cape. She stood in the yard for a moment, looking at the house, looking at the bikers moving around it with purpose and hoses and buckets. And then she ran. She ran up the porch steps and through the front door and into the kitchen where her grandmother stood holding a glass of water with both hands, and she hit the old woman with an embrace so fierce it nearly knocked them both off their feet. Evelyn caught her. Of course she caught her. That's what grandmothers do, even when they're 71 and tired and their arms are trembling and the world has spent the last month trying to take everything they have. They catch the child. They always catch the child. "I found help, Grandma," Ivy whispered into the yellow flowers of the housecoat. "I found help." Evelyn held her. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Her hand moved slowly over the back of Ivy's head, smoothing wet hair, the way she'd done since the girl was 4 years old and afraid of thunder. On the porch, Graves stood with his back to the door, one hand on the railing, looking out at the street. The rain was letting up. The Harleys gleamed under the porch light. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once, then went quiet. Deacon came up the steps and stood beside him. Grinnell's not going to stop, Deacon said quietly. We chased off the hired hands. He'll just send more. I know. What do you want to do? Graves said nothing for a long time. The rain tapped against the brim of an imaginary hat he wasn't wearing, running down his face instead, and he let it. Find out everything about Wade Grinnell, he said finally. Where he lives, where he works, where he eats breakfast, who he owes, who owes him. I want to know what he's afraid of. Deacon nodded. He started to turn, then stopped. Graves. What? The photo on your dash. You flipped it over before the kid got in the truck. Silence. You good? Graves pulled a cigarette from his pocket, lit it. The ember flared orange in the dark, then settled to a steady red glow. Find me Grinnell, he said. Deacon went. Graves stood alone on the blue porch, smoking, listening to the sound of an old woman and a child holding each other inside a house that still smelled like gasoline and almost death. The ember of his cigarette was the only warm light in the dark, and somewhere across town, in an office on the 14th floor of a glass building that didn't belong in the Arizona desert, Wade Grinnell's phone buzzed with a text message from a number he'd never seen before. It said, "The Saints are at the house. All of them." Grinnell stared at the screen. Then he opened his desk drawer and pulled out a file he hadn't looked at in 3 years, a file with a name on the tab that made his hand shake. The name on the file was Mercer. And what was inside it was the one thing in the world that could destroy Graves. Not his body, not his club, but the last fragile thing he was still trying to protect. The truth about how his daughter really died. The file sat open on Wade Grinnell's desk like a wound that refused to close. 3 years of silence. 3 years of keeping this particular piece of paper locked in a drawer he told himself he'd never open again, not because he was a man of principle, but because the information inside it was the kind of weapon you only use once. And once you use it, you'd better be sure the person on the other end doesn't get back up. Grinnell was 51, lean in the way of men who replace meals with ambition, with a face that looked like it had been designed in a boardroom. Sharp angles, clean jaw, teeth so white they seemed aggressive. He wore a charcoal suit at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday because Wade Grinnell did not own clothes that admitted the day was over. His office occupied the 14th floor of the Grinnell Development Group building on the east side of Tucson, a glass tower that rose out of the desert like a middle finger pointed at the landscape. From his window, on a clear day, you could see all the way to the mountains. Tonight you could see rain and your own reflection, and Wade didn't like what either one was showing him. He picked up his phone and dialed. The man who answered was named Denton Sills. He was Grinnell's attorney, his fixer, and the closest thing Wade had to a friend, which said more about Wade than it did about Denton. They sent a motorcycle club, Wade said. Silence on the line. Then, what kind of motorcycle club? The kind with patches and Harleys and a president who looks like he eats rebar for breakfast. The Iron Saints. They showed up at the Rayner property 20 minutes ago and ran my crew off the lot. More silence. Longer this time. Denton. I'm thinking. Think faster. The Iron Saints, Denton said slowly, are not the kind of problem you solve by sending more men. They're a 1%er club with a 30-year history in this county. Half their members are combat veterans. The other half grew up in the system and learned to fight before they learned to read. You don't escalate with people like that, Wade. You go around them. I don't go around anything. I've got 43 properties on this block under contract. The Rayner lot is the last piece. If I don't deliver a clear title to Meridian Capital by the 15th, the entire development deal collapses. $87 million, Denton. That's not a number that goes around. Then use the legal route. File the eminent domain petition. Let the county take 6 months. I have 19 days. Silence again. Then Denton said something that changed the shape of the night. The president. You said his name is what? Mercer. Graves Mercer. A pause so long Wade thought the call had dropped. I have a file on him, Denton said quietly. From the Harmon case. 3 years ago. Do you remember? Wade remembered. The Harmon case was a wrongful death lawsuit that had briefly threatened one of his subcontractors, a demolition company that had cut corners on an asbestos abatement and put 4 families in the hospital. One of those families had a connection to the Iron Saints. The case was settled out of court for a number nobody talked about, but during discovery, Denton had dug up background on every Saint member who might testify. Most of it was useless: criminal records, employment histories, the usual wreckage of hard lives. But the file on Graves Mercer was different. "Send it to me," Wade said. "Wade, listen to me. If you use what's in that file, you're not just fighting a biker. You're fighting a father. And a father with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous thing on earth. Send it to me." Denton sent it. Wade read it alone in his glass office while the rain streaked down the windows and the city below him glittered like something he owned. When he finished reading, he leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a very long time, and something moved behind his eyes that wasn't calculation or strategy, but the cold, mechanical recognition of leverage. He now knew how Graves Mercer's daughter had died, and more importantly, he knew what Graves didn't. The part of the story that had been sealed in a court record and buried under a settlement agreement that Graves had never seen. The part that would break him. Wade closed the file. He picked up his phone, and he began to make calls. Across town, at the Yellow House on Mesa Road, the Iron Saints were still working. It was past midnight now. The gasoline had been hosed off the porch and the foundation, and Koa had run the hose for so long the yard had turned to mud. But the chemical smell had finally faded to something you could breathe through without your eyes watering. Wire had checked the crawl space with a flashlight and confirmed no fuel had soaked into the wooden supports. The house would not burn tonight. But the men who'd put the gasoline there were still out walking the streets of Hardin, and the man who'd paid them was still sitting in a glass tower making phone calls, and everyone in the Iron Saints knew that tonight was just the overture. Graves sat on the porch steps, smoking his third cigarette since they'd arrived. The rain had stopped, finally, but the air was still heavy and wet. The kind of desert humidity that comes after a storm and sits on your skin like a second shirt. His boots were muddy. His jeans were soaked from the knees down. His bad knee had stiffened up from kneeling on the wet ground, and every time he shifted weight, it sent a dull electric pain up his thigh that he ignored with the practiced ease of a man who had been ignoring pain for decades. Inside the house, Ivy had fallen asleep on the couch, with her head in Evelyn's lap. The old woman was still awake, still sitting upright, one hand resting on the girl's damp hair. She hadn't spoken to any of the bikers except Graves, and even then, only 3 words. "Thank you, son." She said it once, when he'd walked her inside, and she said it the way people say things they mean so deeply that saying them feels almost insufficient, like the words are too small for the thing they're carrying. The front door opened behind Graves. He didn't turn. He knew the sound of Deacon's boots. "She's asleep," Deacon said, settling onto the step beside him. He pulled a cigarette from Graves' pack without asking. Lit it, inhaled, let the smoke out through his nose in 2 thin streams. "How old was she when her parents dropped her here?" Deacon asked. 4, that's what the old woman said. "Where are the parents?" "Mother's dead. Overdose. Maybe 6 years back. Father's somewhere in Nevada. Hasn't called in 3 years. Deacon nodded slowly. He looked at the row of Harleys parked along the curb, chrome dulled by rain, then at the street beyond them, dark and empty and stretching toward the edge of town where the desert took over and nothing human grew. Graves. Yeah. You know what this is going to become. We ran off some hired hands tonight. That's the easy part. Grinnell's got money, lawyers, and friends in the county office. He'll come at us through the courts, through the permits office, through whatever angle we can't see yet. This isn't a one-night job. I know. The club voted on the meth corridor. We didn't vote on this. Graves took a long drag. The ember flared. In its light, the lines on his face looked deeper, like cracks in dry earth. Then we vote. Tonight? Now. Deacon looked at him. It's 1 a.m. Then they'll vote tired. Men tell the truth when they're tired. Deacon stubbed his cigarette on the porch step, stood, and walked toward the bikes. 2 minutes later, the Iron Saints were gathered in a loose half-circle in Evelyn Rayner's front yard, standing in mud and wet grass, their breath making small clouds in the cold desert air. 9 men, plus Graves and Deacon. Some of them had their arms crossed. Some had their hands in their pockets. Koa stood with his feet wide and his face unreadable. Wire leaned against the chain-link fence, eyes moving from face to face the way they always did, cataloging reactions before they happened. And there was Roach. Roach's real name was Marcus Bowen, but nobody had called him that in 15 years. He'd earned the name because he was the kind of man who survived everything. Prison, beatings, a stabbing in a truck stop bathroom, outside Flagstaff that should have killed him, but instead left a scar across his abdomen that looked like a zipper. He was the club's sergeant-at-arms, which meant he was responsible for discipline, security, and making sure the Iron Saints' rules were followed by every member regardless of rank. He was good at the job. He was also the only man in the club who could look Graves Mercer in the eye and say no. "This isn't our fight," Roach said. He said it before Graves had even finished explaining the situation, before the vote had been called, before anyone else had spoken. He said it standing in the middle of the half circle with his arms crossed over a chest that looked like it was armored with muscle and bad decisions, and he said it looking directly at Graves with an expression that wasn't hostile but wasn't warm either. The expression of a man who respects you enough to disagree to your face. "We came here because a kid asked for help," Roach continued. "Fine. We ran off some thugs, fine. But now you're talking about going to war with a developer who's got county connections, legal backing, and more money than this club will see in 10 lifetimes. For what? One house? One old woman?" "One client," Graves said. "She's 13. She's not a client. She's a kid who doesn't know what she started." "She knows exactly what she started. She walked 2 miles through the rain to start it. And that's brave. I'm not saying it isn't. But brave doesn't mean smart. And our job isn't to follow brave into a hole we can't climb out of." Roach looked around the circle. "How many of you have warrants? How many of you are on parole? Koa, you've got a custody hearing in 2 weeks. Wire, your mother's in a care home that costs $4,000 a month. Deacon, you—" "Don't," Deacon said quietly. "I'm making a point. Every man here has something to lose. And I'm asking whether we're willing to lose it for a property dispute that's got nothing to do with this club." Silence. The kind of silence that happens when everyone in a room knows the person speaking isn't wrong, but wishes they were. Graves let it sit. He let Roach's words hang in the wet air until they'd been heard and absorbed and considered. Then he spoke. "When I started this club," he said, "it was because I came back from a war and nobody gave a damn. Not the VA. Not the government, not the people I'd been fighting for. I slept in a truck for 11 months. I ate out of gas station trash cans. I got clean, got dirty, got clean again, and every time I asked for help, somebody handed me a pamphlet and a phone number that rang and never picked up." He paused. The cigarette between his fingers had burned down to the filter. He dropped it in the mud. "The Iron Saints exist because the world is full of people who get forgotten. That's what we do. We remember the ones nobody else remembers. That old woman in there got forgotten by the police, by her neighbors, by every system that was supposed to protect her. And her granddaughter, a kid, 13 years old, walked through a storm to find someone who would remember her." He looked at Roach. Steady. No anger. Just the weight of something he'd been carrying for 30 years. "You want to tell that kid we forgot her too?" Roach held his gaze. His jaw worked. His arms stayed crossed. But something shifted behind his eyes. Not agreement, not yet, but the beginning of the slow, painful process of a man whose logic is sound being overruled by something deeper than logic. "Vote," Graves said. It wasn't unanimous, it never is, in clubs that are honest. Roach voted no. A younger member named Piston, 24, fresh patch, still learning the difference between loyalty and obedience, voted no as well, though his no sounded more like uncertainty than opposition. The rest voted yes, 7-2. "It's decided," Graves said. "We protect this house, we protect this family, and we deal with Grinnell." Roach unfolded his arms. He looked at Graves for a long moment, then nodded once, not in agreement, but in acceptance. "In the Iron Saints, you could vote against the table and still ride with the table. That was the difference between a gang and a brotherhood. A gang punishes dissent. A brotherhood survives it." "I'll take first watch," Roach said, and walked to his bike to pull a folding chair from his saddlebag. Graves watched him go. Something in his chest loosened by 1 degree. Not relief, just the absence of one particular tension, replaced immediately by 11 others. Because the truth was, Roach wasn't wrong. This fight was bigger than one house. Grinnell had resources the Saints couldn't match: lawyers, money, political connections that went all the way to the county commission. The Iron Saints had muscle, reputation, and the willingness to bleed. In a straight fight, muscle wins. But this wasn't going to be a straight fight. Grinnell would come at them sideways, through angles they couldn't see, and the club would need more than leather and engines to survive it. Graves pulled out his phone. He scrolled through a contact list that was short and composed almost entirely of names that belonged to men who lived on the other side of the law. He stopped on one. The name was Lena Vasek. He hadn't called her in 3 years. The last time they'd spoken, she'd told him that if he ever contacted her again, she'd put a bullet in his phone and then one in his kneecap. And he'd believed her on both counts. Lena Vasek was a former investigative journalist who'd lost her career, her marriage, and 2 fingers on her left hand digging into a corruption case that touched the same county officials Grinnell now kept on his payroll. She knew where the bodies were buried, figuratively, and in at least one case, literally. She was also the woman Graves had been in love with for 7 years and had never told, because Graves Mercer did not tell people things like that. He stored it the way he stored everything else: deep, quiet, locked behind a door marked, "Do not open." He pressed the call button. It rang 4 times, 5, 6, click. "It's 2 in the morning." Her voice was rough with sleep and something harder than sleep. Whiskey, maybe. Or just years. "I need your help." A pause. He could hear her breathing. He could hear something else, too. The sound of a television playing low in another room, the particular blue light murmur of a woman who falls asleep with the screen on because the silence is worse. "You've got some nerve, Graves." "I know. I told you what would happen if you called me again." "I remember. And you're calling anyway." "Yeah." Another pause. Longer. He heard the creak of bed springs, the click of a lamp, the sound of someone sitting up and deciding against every instinct to listen. "Talk," she said. He talked. He told her about Ivy, about Evelyn, about the gasoline on the porch and the men who put it there. He told her about Grinnell and the development deal and the 19-day deadline. He told her everything except the one thing he couldn't say, which was that hearing her voice after 3 years felt like stepping into a warm room after a long winter and knowing you didn't deserve to be there. When he finished, Lena was quiet for 10 full seconds. "Wade Grinnell," she said finally. "You're sure?" "That's the name the hired man gave." "Graves, do you know who Wade Grinnell is?" "I know he's a developer with money, and he's not just a developer. He's the developer. He's got 14 active projects across 3 counties. He's personally donated $200,000 to the county commission chair's re-election campaign. He's got a private security firm on retainer, not thugs with gas cans, real security, ex-military, licensed, and he's got Denton Sills." The name hit Graves like cold water. "Sills," he repeated. "Yeah, Sills. The same Denton Sills who handled the Harmon settlement. The same Denton Sills who, during discovery for that case, pulled background files on every member of the Iron Saints who might testify, including you." Graves said nothing. The cigarette pack in his pocket suddenly felt heavier. "Graves, are you listening to me?" "I'm listening." "Sills has a file on you. I don't know what's in it, but I know it exists because I saw a reference to it in the discovery documents before they were sealed. Whatever is in that file, Grinnell now has access to it. And a man like Grinnell doesn't keep weapons he doesn't intend to use." Graves stood on the porch of the yellow house and felt the night grow colder around him. Not the air. The air was the same temperature it had been 5 minutes ago. But something inside his chest had changed climate, and the cold was spreading outward from a place he couldn't reach. "What do you need from me?" Lena asked. "Everything you've got on Grinnell. Financials, property records, county permits, whatever angles he's working." "That's a lot of digging. I'll need access to the county clerk's database, and I burned that bridge when I published the Harbor Commission story." "Can you rebuild it?" "Maybe. Give me 48 hours. "You've got 24. "You haven't changed at all." "Neither have you." She almost laughed. Almost. It came out as a short exhale through her nose, the ghost of a sound that used to be warm. "Graves, Yeah. Whatever's in that file Sills has on you, whatever it is, you need to find out before Grinnell uses it. Because if he hits you with something you don't see coming, it won't just hurt you. It'll hurt every person standing behind you. She hung up. Graves put the phone in his pocket and stood very still on the blue porch, staring at the row of Harleys along the curb and the dark street beyond them and the desert beyond that, stretching out into nothing. Behind him, through the screen door, he could hear Ivy breathing in her sleep, slow, even, the breath of a child who, for the first time in days, felt safe enough to let go. He thought about the file. He thought about his daughter. He thought about the hospital room and the machine that breathed for her and the 9 days he'd sat beside that bed watching numbers on a screen drop by fractions, and the doctor who'd come in on the 9th night and said, "Mr. Mercer, there's nothing more we can do," and the way those words had sounded like a door being locked from the inside. He had always believed it was an accident, a car accident on Route 17, a truck driver who fell asleep at the wheel, a collision that was nobody's fault and everybody's tragedy. That's what the police report said. That's what the insurance settlement said. That's what he told himself every night for 3 years when the memory came scratching at the door. But now Lena was telling him there was a file with his name on it, a file connected to Denton Sills, who was connected to Wade Grinnell, who was connected to the same county infrastructure that had processed the accident report, the hospital records, the settlement paperwork. What if it wasn't an accident? The thought entered his mind like a blade, thin, cold, and so sharp he didn't feel it at first. He stood on the porch and breathed and felt the thought settle into the tissue of his brain, and he understood with the clarity of a man who has spent his whole life reading the grammar of violence that this thought, once admitted, could never be taken back. It would change everything. It would change who he was. It would change what the Iron Saints were. It would turn a protection job into something personal, something vengeful, something that had no brakes and no exit ramp. And that terrified him. Not because he was afraid of violence. Graves Mercer had never been afraid of violence. What terrified him was that some part of him, some deep and buried part, that lived beneath the grief and the guilt and the years of careful stillness, wanted it to be true. Because if his daughter's death wasn't an accident, then there was someone to blame. And if there was someone to blame, then there was something to do with all the rage he'd been drowning in silence and cigarettes and long rides to nowhere for 3 years. And that rage, if he let it loose, would burn down everything around him. The club, the girl, the old woman, the fragile temporary structure of safety he'd built tonight on a dead-end street with a crumpled dollar bill. Graves Mercer stood on the blue porch at 2 a.m. and faced the most dangerous choice of his life. Go looking for the truth and risk destroying everything, or leave it buried and never know. Dawn was still 4 hours away. He reached for his phone. He dialed Lena's number again. She answered on the first ring this time, like she'd been waiting. "The file," he said. His voice was different now. Lower, tighter. The voice of a man standing at the edge of something he cannot unstand at. "The one Sills has. I need to know everything that's in it. Graves, everything. You might not want what you find. I know." Lena breathed once, twice, 3 times. He could hear her making the decision, the click of it, almost audible, like a safety being switched off. "There's a woman," Lena said. "A nurse. She was on duty at St. Jerome's the night they brought your daughter in. She was deposed during the Harmon discovery, but her testimony was sealed. I tried to get a copy 3 years ago and hit a wall." "What's her name?" "Grace Holloway. She lives in Mesa now. Retired." "What did she see?" "That's the thing, Graves. I don't know what she saw, but I know Denton Sills paid her $60,000 to stop talking about it, and people don't get paid $60,000 to keep quiet about an accident." The line went dead. Graves stood on the porch with the phone pressed to his ear long after the call ended, listening to the silence the way a man listens to a sound he can't identify, with every nerve alert and every muscle still, waiting for the shape of it to become clear. Behind him, through the screen door, Ivy murmured in her sleep. A small sound, a child's sound, the sound of someone dreaming in a house that almost burned. Graves lowered the phone. He looked down at his hands, scarred, tattooed, The hands that had held his daughter's hand for 9 days and then held nothing. The hands that had caught a gas can tonight and lifted a man off the ground. The hands that a 13-year-old girl had trusted with a dollar bill and a desperate prayer. These hands were about to reach into a darkness he might not come back from. He put the phone in his pocket. He walked down the porch steps. He crossed the mud yard to where Roach sat in his folding chair by the curb, shotgun laid across his knees, watching the street with the infinite patience of a man who'd learned to wait in places far worse than this. Roach. Prez? I need to go to Mesa tomorrow. Alone. Roach looked at him, studied him, read the geography of his face the way a tracker reads terrain, noting the new tension around the jaw, the shift in the eyes, the particular stillness that settles over Graves when something has changed inside him that he hasn't shared yet. Alone, Roach repeated. Yeah. What's in Mesa? Something I should have looked for 3 years ago. Roach didn't ask what. He knew the shape of Graves' silences well enough to know that this one was a closed door, and pushing on it would only make it lock. I'll hold the house, Roach said. Graves nodded. He turned to walk back to the porch, then stopped. Roach. Yeah. If something happens to me, if I don't come back from Mesa, you take the gavel, and you protect that girl, no matter what. Roach's face didn't change, but his hand moved on the shotgun, a small adjustment, a tightening of the grip that said everything his expression didn't. Nothing's going to happen to you, Press. Promise me. The two men looked at each other across 12 feet of muddy yard and 30 years of shared road. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of every mile, every fight, every funeral, every 3 a.m. conversation in some parking lot in some town whose name they'd already forgotten. I promise, Roach said. Graves walked back to the porch. He sat on the top step. He lit his last cigarette and watched the dark street and waited for dawn, knowing that when it came, he would ride toward a truth that had teeth. And somewhere in Mesa, in a small house with a garden full of dead rose bushes, a retired nurse named Grace Holloway sat in her kitchen at 2:30 in the morning, unable to sleep, the way she'd been unable to sleep for 3 years, staring at a phone she kept expecting to ring. Because Grace Holloway knew what had happened in that hospital room. She knew it wasn't an accident, and she knew that the man who had paid her to keep quiet had just made an enemy of the one person in the world she had hoped would never come asking. Graves left before the sun. He didn't tell anyone except Roach. He didn't leave a note. He pulled on his road jacket in the gray pre-dawn dark, walked past Koa sleeping in the folding chair on watch with the shotgun across his thighs, and pushed his Harley half a block down Mesa Road before starting the engine so the sound wouldn't wake the house. The motor caught on the second kick, coughing once, then settling into the deep, familiar rumble that had been the only constant in his life for 20 years. He rolled onto Route 9 heading west, and the desert opened up around him like an empty hand. Mesa was 112 miles from Hardin. On a good day, that was an hour and 40 minutes. Today wasn't a good day. The storm had left the highway slick and scattered with debris, tumbleweeds, gravel, a shredded truck tire splayed across the shoulder like a dead animal. Graves rode at 60. Helmet visor cracked open an inch to let the cold air hit his face, because the cold kept him present, and present was the only place he could afford to be right now. He had not slept. His eyes were red-rimmed and dry, and his hands on the grips felt like they belonged to someone older than he was. The bad knee throbbed in time with the engine. His back ached from sitting on porch steps for 3 hours. And behind all of it, beneath the physical noise of a body that had been used hard for 53 years, there was a single thought rotating in his skull like a wheel that wouldn't stop turning. People don't get paid $60,000 to keep quiet about an accident. Lena's words. Lena's voice. Lena's particular way of delivering a truth that cuts, not with emotion but with precision, like a surgeon making an incision in exactly the place that bleeds the most. He rode. The sun came up somewhere behind the mountains to his left, turning the sky from black to gray to a pale, washed-out blue that looked exhausted, like the sky itself hadn't slept either. By the time he hit the Mesa City limits, the morning was bright and flat and ordinary, and the ordinariness of it felt like an insult. Grace Holloway's house was on a cul-de-sac at the end of a street called Primrose Lane, which was the kind of name that people give to streets when they want to pretend the world is softer than it actually is. The house was small, tan stucco, with a red tile roof and a yard full of dead rose bushes that had been dead long enough to look intentional, like some kind of statement about giving up. There was a green sedan in the driveway and a wind chime on the porch that wasn't moving because there was no wind. Graves parked his Harley at the curb. He sat on it for a full minute, both boots on the ground, hands still on the grips, looking at the house. A curtain moved in the front window. Someone was watching him. He got off the bike, walked up the driveway. His boots sounded wrong on the clean concrete, too heavy, too rough, a sound that didn't belong in a place like this. He rang the doorbell and waited. The door opened 3 inches, held by a chain lock. Through the gap, he saw a woman's face. She was maybe 60, with short gray hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and eyes that were not surprised. That was the first thing he noticed. She was not surprised to see a biker standing on her doorstep at 7:30 in the morning. She had the expression of a person who has been expecting a knock for a very long time and is almost relieved it finally came. "Grace Holloway?" he said. "I know who you are," she said. Her voice was steady, careful, the voice of a woman who had rehearsed this moment. "I've known you'd come eventually. I just didn't know when. Can I come in?" She looked at him through the 3-inch gap, looked at his leather cut, his scars, the patch that said President. Looked at his eyes, which were asking something his mouth hadn't. "I'll make coffee," she said, and closed the door to undo the chain. The kitchen was clean in the way that kitchens are clean when only one person uses them. White counters, a single mug in the drying rack, a calendar on the wall with no markings on any of the days. Grace moved around the small space with the efficiency of a nurse. Kettle, filter, grounds, water. And Graves stood near the doorway because the kitchen was too small for a man his size, and sitting down felt like something he wouldn't be able to undo. She poured 2 cups, set one on the counter near his hand, took the other to the small table by the window, and sat down and looked at him the way you look at a wound you're about to clean. 3 years ago, Graves said. "St. Jerome's Hospital. My daughter, Lily Mercer. You were on duty the night she came in." Grace nodded. She wrapped both hands around her mug. The 2 missing fingers on her left hand. No, that was Lena. Grace had all her fingers. They were trembling. "I was the intake nurse," she said. "Trauma unit. She came in at 11:40 p.m. Ambulance brought her from the Route 17 accident site." What happened? It wasn't a question. It was an opening. A door held ajar. Grace looked into her coffee. The steam rose around her face like something trying to obscure her. What happened is not what the report says happened. Graves's hand tightened on the mug. He didn't drink. He didn't move. He stood in that woman's kitchen and felt the floor beneath his feet become less solid, as if the house were built on something that had been shifting for 3 years and was only now beginning to give way. "Tell me," he said. Grace took a breath. Let it out. Took another. "Your daughter's injuries were not consistent with the accident report. The report said it was a single-vehicle collision. A truck driver fell asleep, crossed the median, hit the car. Head-on impact. That's what they filed. That's what the insurance company paid out on. That's what everyone accepted. But I've worked trauma for 27 years. I've seen what head-on collisions do to a body. The injuries your daughter had, the pattern, the distribution, the specific fractures, they weren't from a head-on. They were from a side impact, a T-bone collision, driver's side." Graves set the mug down on the counter. He set it down carefully, deliberately, because if he didn't concentrate on the careful placement of the mug, his hand was going to do something else, something that involved the counter, or the wall, or the cabinet door, or anything in this room that could be broken. "What does that mean?" he said. His voice was flat. Not calm. Flat. The way water is flat just before it boils. "It means your daughter's car wasn't hit by an oncoming truck. It was hit from the side, at an intersection, which means the truck didn't cross the median. It ran through a cross street. That's not what the police report says." "No, it's not." "Why?" Grace looked at him. Her eyes were wet now, but her voice stayed steady. And Graves understood in that moment that this woman had been carrying this for 3 years the way he'd been carrying his grief. Not on her shoulders, but in her chest, in the cage of her ribs, in the place where things live when you can't put them down and can't tell anyone you're holding them. Because the truck belonged to Grinnell Development Group, she said, and the driver was on the clock, hauling demolition debris from one of Grinnell's sites. The truck had been flagged for a brake inspection 2 weeks earlier and never taken in. The driver had been on shift for 14 hours. He ran a stop sign at the Route 17 junction because his brakes didn't hold, and he hit your daughter's car on the driver's side at 53 miles an hour. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. The wind chime on the porch still wasn't moving. Someone changed the report, Graves said. Denton Sills changed the report. He got to the responding officers before the accident reconstruction team could file their analysis. He had the truck removed from the scene within 2 hours. He had the intersection cameras pulled. Said it was a county maintenance issue. He had the whole thing rewritten as a single-vehicle median crossing, and he paid me $60,000 to never say what I just told you. Why did you take the money? Grace flinched. It was small, a tightening around the eyes, a slight withdrawal of the shoulders. But Graves saw it, and he knew he'd put his finger on the exact place where her guilt lived. Because I was scared, she said. Because Sills came to my house, this house, and sat where you're standing and told me that if I talked, I would lose my license, my pension, and my ability to work anywhere in the state. He said it politely. He said it the way men like him say everything, like they're offering you a choice when there is no choice. And I was 57 years old and alone, and I didn't have the courage to fight him. She set her mug down. Coffee sloshed over the rim. I've been waiting for you for 3 years, she said again, and this time her voice broke on the word years. And Graves understood that the 6-syllable sentence contained a confession and a plea and an apology that she didn't know how to shape into words. Graves Mercer stood in Grace Holloway's kitchen and felt the world rearrange itself. Everything he had believed for 3 years, every sleepless night, every highway ride to nowhere, every visit to the small grave in the Harding Cemetery where he'd sit on the ground and talk to the grass and tell himself that what happened to Lily was a tragedy but not a crime. All of it was wrong. His daughter hadn't been killed by fate. She'd been killed by negligence, by greed, by a broken truck that shouldn't have been on the road, and a company that knew it, and a lawyer who buried the evidence, and a system that looked the other way because the man who owned the truck also owned the system. Wade Grinnell killed his daughter. The thought arrived fully formed, like something that had been assembled in the dark for 3 years and was now stepping into the light. It didn't feel like a revelation. It felt like a confirmation, like some part of him, the part that had never accepted the randomness of it, the part that sat in that hospital room for 9 days waiting for something to make sense, had always known. His hands were shaking, not his voice, not his face, his hands. The tattooed, scarred hands that had held his daughter's fingers while the machine breathed for her. They were shaking the way they hadn't shaken in 30 years, not since the war, not since the things he'd done in places he would never name. "Do you have documentation?" he said. His voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere outside his body. "I have the intake photographs. The original injury assessment I filed before Sills had it amended. I kept copies of everything. I kept them because..." She stopped, swallowed. "Because someday I was going to find the courage to give them to someone. I just didn't know who." "Give them to me." Grace left the kitchen. Graves heard a closet door open, heard the sound of a heavy box being pulled from a shelf. She came back with a manila envelope thick enough to fill both hands. She held it out to him, and when he took it, their fingers touched, and her hand was cold and his hand was shaking, and neither of them acknowledged either thing. "Mr. Mercer." He looked at her. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to say this 3 years ago. If I had, maybe..." "Don't," he said. Not angry, not kind. Just a man who couldn't hold one more thing. "Just don't." He walked out of the house with the envelope under his arm. He walked down the driveway to his Harley, and he stood beside it for a long time, one hand on the seat, the other holding the envelope against his chest like something alive. And he breathed. The breathing was important. It was the only thing keeping him from getting on the bike and riding straight to the glass tower on the east side of Tucson and walking into Wade Grinnell's office and doing something that would end with one of them dead and the other in prison. He breathed because breathing was the leash he put on the animal that lived inside his chest. The animal that had been sleeping for 3 years and was now awake and pacing and throwing itself against the walls of its cage. He thought about Ivy, the dollar bill, the yellow house, the old woman in the rocking chair, the bikers standing in the rain voting to protect something that wasn't theirs to protect. He thought about the promise he'd made Roach. If I don't come back, protect that girl. He thought about Lily. And then he got on the bike and rode. Not to Tucson, not to Grinnell, not to... He rode back to Hardin, 112 miles of empty highway, with the sun now high and white above the desert. And he rode faster than he should have because the speed was the only thing louder than his thoughts. He arrived at the yellow house at 10:15 in the morning. The scene had changed while he was gone. 2 more saints had arrived. A married pair named Dutch and his wife Sable, who wasn't technically a member but had been riding with the club for 12 years and could strip a Harley engine faster than most of the patched men. They'd brought food, grocery bags of bread, lunch meat, canned soup, and a flat of bottled water. Sable was in the kitchen making sandwiches while Evelyn sat at the table watching her with the bewildered gratitude of a woman who hasn't had another person in her kitchen in years. Ivy was on the porch with Roach. They were sitting side by side in folding chairs, not talking, just watching the street. Roach had the shotgun across his knees. Ivy had a book in her lap, some paperbacks she'd found in the house, but she wasn't reading it. She was watching the road the way Roach was watching the road, with the focused, patient stillness of a person on guard duty. She'd learned the posture from him in a single night. Kids absorb things fast when survival depends on it. When Graves' Harley turned onto Mesa Road, Ivy stood up. The book fell off her lap. She watched him pull up to the curb and kill the engine, and something in her face shifted. A flash of relief so naked it hurt to look at, followed immediately by a mask of composure that no 13-year-old should know how to wear. "You came back," she said. "I said I would." People say a lot of things. Graves looked at her, looked at the book on the porch floor, looked at the folding chair next to Roach, still warm from where she'd been sitting. "Yeah," he said, "they do." He walked past her into the house. He found Deacon in the living room, sitting on the couch cleaning a handgun with an oiled rag, the parts laid out on a newspaper on the coffee table, with the precision of a man who'd done this 10,000 times. "Church," Graves said. "Now, the garage." Deacon looked up, read his face, set the gun down. "How bad?" "Bring everyone." The meeting happened in Evelyn's detached garage, a one-car structure at the back of the property that smelled like motor oil and sawdust and hadn't held a car since Ray Rayner died. Graves stood at the back wall, facing the door, with the manila envelope on a workbench beside him. The saints filed in one by one: Deacon, Roach, Koa, Wire, Dutch, Piston, and 2 others who'd arrived that morning. A quiet man called Bishop, who handled the club's money, and a heavy-set biker named Tank, who had once been a sheriff's deputy in a county 4 hours north and still walked like one. 9 men in a garage. The door was closed. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly in a draft nobody could feel, throwing shadows that moved across the concrete floor like living things. "What I'm about to tell you changes everything," Graves said. "And once I tell you, there's no going back to last night. Last night, we were protecting a house. After this, we're at war. And I need every man in this room to understand that before I open my mouth." The garage was silent, not the comfortable silence of men who know each other, the loaded silence of men who can feel the weight of what's coming. This morning I drove to Mesa and spoke with a woman named Grace Holloway. She was the intake nurse at St. Jerome's Hospital the night my daughter was brought in 3 years ago. Nobody moved. The name Lily had not been spoken inside the Iron Saints in a long time. It was one of those names that lived in the space between spoken and forbidden. Everyone knew it. Everyone remembered what it had done to Graves, and nobody brought it up because bringing it up meant acknowledging that their president was held together by willpower and not much else. The accident that killed Lily wasn't an accident. Graves said it flat. No emotion, no pause for effect. He said it the way you read a number off a page, as a fact, stripped of everything except its own weight. The truck that hit her belonged to Grinnell Development Group, Wade Grinnell's company. The driver was on a 14-hour shift with failed brakes. Grinnell knew the truck was flagged. He ran it anyway. And when the truck killed my daughter, his lawyer, Denton Sills, rewrote the accident report, buried the evidence, paid off the nurse, and made it look like a random collision. He opened the manila envelope, pulled out the photographs, the intake assessment, the original injury report. He spread them on the workbench under the single bulb, and the men leaned in, one by one, and looked at what 3 years of buried truth looked like on paper. Nobody spoke for a long time. Koa was the first to move. He stepped back from the workbench and put both hands on top of his head, fingers interlaced, the way people do when they're trying to keep something inside their skull from expanding. Deacon picked up one of the photographs. His prosthetic hand made a small clicking sound against the paper. He studied it for 10 seconds, then set it down with the careful precision of a man handling something explosive. "This is verified," Deacon said. The nurse kept copies of everything, original timestamps, original assessments before Sills had them amended. And Grinnell knows we're here, at this house, protecting the Rayner family. Yes. Which means the man who killed your daughter is the same man we're fighting right now. Yes. The garage absorbed this. The single bulb swayed. Shadows moved. Roach spoke next, and his voice was different than it had been last night during the vote. Last night he'd been the voice of pragmatism, of caution, of a man arguing against a fight he thought was too big. Now his voice had something in it that Graves had only heard twice before. Once in a bar in Phoenix when a man put hands on a woman and Roach broke 3 of his ribs, and once at a funeral for a club brother who'd been killed by a drunk driver. It was rage, controlled, compressed, and far more dangerous than the loud kind. "What do you need?" Roach said. "I need to know if this room is with me, all the way. Not for Evelyn's house, not for Ivy, for this, for what was done to my daughter. Because what I'm about to do will bring the full weight of Grinnell's money, Sills' lawyers, and whatever friends they have in the county down on this club, and some of us might not walk out the other side." "You already know the answer," Roach said. "I need to hear it." Roach looked around the garage. Every man met his eyes. Every man nodded. "We're with you," Roach said, "all the way to the wall and through it." Graves nodded, just once. He gathered the photographs and the documents and put them back in the envelope, and his hands were steady now. So it's not because the shaking had stopped, but because something had replaced it, something harder and colder that locked the tremor down the way a tourniquet locks down bleeding. "Wire." "Yeah, Press." "I need Grinnell's corporate records. Every truck in his fleet, every maintenance log, every inspection report for the last 5 years. If that truck was flagged and ran anyway, there's a paper trail. Find it. On it. Bishop. Here." Sills paid the nurse 60 grand. That money came from somewhere. Find the account. Find the payment. If it went through Grinnell's books, that's fraud. If it went through Sills' personal accounts, that's obstruction. I'll need access to... Lena Vasic is working the county angle. Coordinate with her. Whatever she needs, she gets. Bishop raised an eyebrow. The name Lena Vasic carried its own weight in this room. Everyone knew the history. Not the romantic part, which Graves had never confirmed, but the professional part. Lena had been the journalist who'd nearly blown the Harmon case wide open before Sills shut her down. Her involvement meant the stakes had just doubled. "Tank?" "Prez?" "You used to carry a badge. You still know people inside the system?" Tank's jaw tightened. He'd left law enforcement under circumstances that were technically a resignation and practically a firing after he'd refused to falsify a report for a county supervisor. It was the reason he'd ended up in the Iron Saints Ward, because the club was full of men who'd been punished for doing the right thing and had stopped expecting the system to reward honesty. "I know a few," Tank said. "Not all of them will talk." "Huh? I only need one. Someone with access to sealed records. Specifically the accident reconstruction analysis for the Route 17 incident 3 years ago. Sills had it buried during the Harmon discovery. It's in the county system somewhere. I need a copy." "That's a felony if I'm caught pulling it." "I know." "I'll have it by tomorrow night." Graves looked at each man in the garage, looked at their faces, hard, scarred, lined with years of road and weather, and the particular erosion that comes from living outside the systems that protect softer people. These men had followed him into fights that made no sense on paper, and every kind of sense in the space between the ribs where loyalty lives. He was about to take them somewhere none of them had been. "One more thing," he said, "and this is the part that doesn't leave this room." The garage went still, stiller than it already was. "Grinnell doesn't know what I know, not yet. He knows we're protecting the Rayner house. He knows I'm the president of the Saints, but he doesn't know I've connected him to Lily. Right now, he thinks this is a property dispute. He thinks I'm a biker who showed up to help an old woman. That's his advantage. He thinks he knows who I am and why I'm here." Graves paused. The bulb swayed. "I want to keep it that way, for now. Let him think we're still fighting about a house. Let him send his lawyers and his permits and his county friends. Let him think he's winning. Because while he's looking at the front door, we're going to go through the basement and pull the foundation out from under everything he's built." Deacon leaned forward. "And when he finds out, when he realizes this isn't about the house, then he'll use the file, the one Sills has on me. He'll try to use Lily's death as leverage, to break me, to discredit me, to turn the club against itself." "And?" Graves picked up the manila envelope, held it up so every man could see it. "And we'll already have the truth. All of it. Documented. Verified. Ready to burn his world down." He tucked the envelope inside his cut, against his chest, next to the place where the crumpled dollar bill still sat in his pocket. "We ride smart. We ride quiet. And when the time comes, we ride hard enough to make sure this man never forgets the name Lily Mercer." The meeting broke. Men filed out into the morning sun, blinking, adjusting to light after the dim garage, and each one walked a little differently than he had walking in, heavier in the boots, tighter in the jaw, carrying the particular weight of men who have just agreed to something that cannot be undone. Graves was the last one out. He stood in the garage doorway and looked across the yard at the yellow house. Through the kitchen window, he could see Evelyn at the table and Ivy beside her, eating a sandwich that Sable had made. And the girl was saying something that made the old woman's shoulders shake, with laughter, Graves realized. Laughter. In a house that smelled like gasoline 12 hours ago. His phone buzzed. A text. Unknown number. Just like the one Grinnell had received last night. But this one wasn't for Grinnell. It said, "I know what the nurse told you. I know what's in the envelope, and I know you're going to make this personal. Before you do, just ask your VP what he was doing at Denton Sills' office 6 months ago. Ask him why he was there, and ask him what he signed." Graves read the message twice, 3 times. The words didn't change. He looked up from the phone. Across the yard, Deacon was walking toward his Harley, prosthetic hand catching the sun, moving with the easy stride of a man who had nothing to hide. Deacon. His VP. His closest brother in the club. The man who'd ridden beside him for 18 years. The man who'd sat in the hospital waiting room for all 9 days. The man who'd carried Lily's coffin. Ask your VP what he was doing at Denton Sills' office 6 months ago. The ground shifted again. Not the physical ground. The ground beneath everything Graves had built his life on. The brotherhood, the trust, the belief that the men who wore the same patch would never be the ones to put a knife in your back. He pocketed the phone. He looked at Deacon. And Deacon, as if feeling the weight of the gaze, turned and looked back. Their eyes met across 30 feet of sunlit yard. Deacon smiled, the easy, familiar smile of a brother who has no idea what's coming. And Graves did not smile back. Graves didn't confront Deacon that day, or the next. He watched him instead, the way a man watches a crack in a dam, constantly, quietly, waiting to see if it spreads. He watched how Deacon held his coffee in the morning, whether the prosthetic hand trembled when he wasn't thinking about it. He watched who Deacon called when he stepped away from the group, how long the calls lasted, whether his voice dropped or his shoulders tightened when he came back. He watched the way Deacon's eyes moved when Graves mentioned Sills' name in conversation, whether they flinched, whether they held, Whether they did that particular thing guilty men's eyes do when they hear a word that lives too close to the secret they're keeping. 2 days, 48 hours of watching his best friend through the lens of suspicion, and every hour was a kind of poison that Graves could feel spreading through the tissue of a relationship that had been the closest thing to trust he'd allowed himself in 20 years. On the second night, Graves sat on the tailgate of the club truck in Evelyn Reiner's driveway, alone, at 1 a.m. The street was quiet. Koa had the watch, sitting in his folding chair at the end of the walkway, with the patience of a man who could sit still for days if the situation required it. Inside the house, lights were off. Ivy and Evelyn were sleeping. The Iron Saints had established a rotation, 2 men on property at all times, shifts changing every 8 hours. And the rhythm of it had settled into something that almost felt normal, the way war zones develop routines that make the abnormal bearable. Graves pulled out his phone. He opened the anonymous text message and read it again for the 30th time. Ask your VP what he was doing at Denton Sills's office 6 months ago. He could ask. He could walk up to Deacon right now, show him the text, and say, "What were you doing there?" And Deacon would either tell the truth or lie, and Graves would have to decide which one it was based on the movement of muscles in a face he'd trusted for 18 years. That was the problem with trust. Once you start testing it, the test itself becomes the damage. Even if Deacon was innocent, the question would land like an accusation, and accusations leave marks that don't heal clean. But Graves couldn't wait much longer. Wire and Bishop were deep in Grinnell's records now. Tank was working his contact inside the county system. Lena was pulling financial threads that connected Grinnell to the county commission. The machine was moving, and every person inside it needed to trust every other person completely, because one weak link, one leak, one phone call to the wrong number would bring the whole thing down and put every saint at risk. If Deacon was compromised, Graves needed to know, tonight. He put the phone away. He walked to the back of the property where Deacon's Harley was parked beside the garage, chrome dulled by 2 days of dew and desert dust. He crouched beside it, his bad knee screaming, and he reached under the seat where riders keep personal items in the small storage compartment. His hand found a phone. Not Deacon's regular phone, a second one, a burner. Black, prepaid, the kind you buy at a gas station counter and throw away when you're done. Graves held it in the dark and felt the weight of it in his palm like a verdict. He turned it on. The screen lit up blue-white, harsh against the dark yard. No lock, no passcode. Either Deacon was careless or he didn't think anyone would look. The call log showed 6 numbers, all the same number. Calls lasting between 2 and 14 minutes, spread across the last 3 months. Graves called the number. It rang twice. A voice answered, smooth, professional, the voice of a man accustomed to speaking to people who had no choice but to listen. You're calling late, Mr. Bowen. Bowen. Deacon's real name was James Bowen. Nobody used it. Nobody except people who knew him from before. Graves said nothing. He let the silence do the work. Mr. Bowen? Is there a problem? The voice belonged to Denton Sills. Graves recognized it now. Not from personal experience, but from a deposition recording Lena had played for him over the phone earlier that day, part of the Harmon case discovery she'd managed to unseal. The same smooth, calibrated voice, the same careful enunciation of a man who billed by the hour and made sure every syllable was worth the rate. Graves hung up. He stood in the dark yard holding the burner phone, and for a moment, just a moment, the animal inside his chest broke free of its cage. It didn't roar. It didn't thrash. It went cold. Arctic cold. The kind of cold that doesn't burn but freezes, that stops blood and thought and mercy simultaneously. And in that frozen moment, Graves Mercer understood with absolute clarity that if he went inside and found Deacon right now, he would hurt him in a way that couldn't be taken back. So he didn't go inside. He put the burner phone in his pocket. He walked to the curb. He sat on his Harley and gripped the handlebars until his knuckles turned white, and his forearms shook, and the metal bit into his palms, hard enough to leave marks. He sat there for 11 minutes. He breathed. He counted breaths the way the VA therapist had taught him 20 years ago. In for 4, hold for 7, out for 8. And he hated that it worked, hated that something so simple could leash something so savage. But it did, And after 11 minutes, the ice in his chest receded enough for him to think. Not feel. Think. Deacon had been talking to Sills for 3 months. 3 months. Which meant this had started before Ivy. Before the yellow house. Before the gasoline on the porch. Whatever Deacon's connection to Sills was, it predated the Rayner situation by weeks. Maybe longer. But the text message, the anonymous one, had said 6 months ago. Deacon was at Sills's office 6 months ago. And he signed something. What did he sign? Graves needed to know, and there was only one way to find out that didn't involve beating it out of his best friend in an old woman's backyard at 1 a.m. He texted Lena. 4 words. Sills. Deacon. 6 months. She replied in 30 seconds. Working on it. Don't do anything stupid. He almost smiled. Almost. The next 18 hours moved like a slow-burning fuse. Graves said nothing to Deacon. He conducted business as usual, checking the watch rotation, reviewing the intel wire and Bishop had gathered, coordinating with Tank's county contact. He spoke to Deacon 3 times during the day, and each time his voice was level and his face was still, and the burner phone in his pocket felt like a live grenade pressed against his thigh. At 4 p.m, Wire came to him in the garage with a laptop balanced on one arm and a look on his face that Graves hadn't seen since the night they'd found the dead kid in the drainage ditch. I found the truck, Wire said, the one that hit Lily. Graves closed the garage door. Wire set the laptop on the workbench and turned the screen toward him. On it was a maintenance database. Grinnell Development Group's internal fleet records, pulled from a server that Wire had accessed through methods Graves didn't ask about and Wire didn't explain. Vehicle number GDG117. 2019 Kenworth T880 dump truck. Assigned to the Route 17 demolition project. Flagged for a brake inspection on October 3rd. Inspection was scheduled for October 10th. It was never performed. The truck stayed in rotation. On October 17th, it was logged on a night haul from the demolition site to the county landfill. The driver's shift started at 6 a.m. The accident occurred at 11:40 p.m. That's 17 hours and 40 minutes on the clock. Wire paused. His fingers moved across the keyboard. And here's the thing, Press. The maintenance flag wasn't a routine inspection. It was a critical safety flag. The brake pads on the rear axle were measured at 1.2 millimeters. Minimum legal threshold is 3. Someone flagged it, someone saw the flag, and this signature right here. He pointed to a scanned document on the screen. Someone signed off on keeping the truck in service anyway. Graves looked at the signature. He couldn't read it. It was the kind of illegible scrawl that executives use to sign things they don't want to be held accountable for. Can you identify it? Already did. Cross-referenced it with Grinnell's corporate filings. That signature belongs to Wade Grinnell, personally. He signed off on running a truck with failing brakes, and 9 days later that truck killed your daughter. The garage was very quiet. The laptop screen glowed blue-white in the dim space, and Graves's face, lit from below, looked like something carved from stone, hard, immobile, and cracked in places you couldn't see unless you were standing very close. Print everything, he said, everything you've got, and put it with the nurse's file. Wire nodded. He started to close the laptop, then stopped. President, there's something else. What? I was pulling Grinnell's corporate communications, emails mostly, between Grinnell and Sills. Routine stuff, legal billing, project updates. But 6 months ago, there's a cluster of encrypted messages between Sills and an outside party. I couldn't crack the encryption, but I could see the metadata. The recipient's email is registered to a James Bowen. The name landed in the garage like a stone dropped into still water. How many messages? Graves said. 14. Over a 2-week period. Then they stop. What happened at the end of the 2 weeks? Wire looked at him. I don't know, but the timing lines up with a $60,000 wire transfer from Sills's personal account to a numbered account in Nevada. I can't confirm the account holder, but it's Deacon. Wire didn't flinch. He'd already done the math. Yeah, Wire said quietly. I think it is. Graves put both hands on the workbench and leaned forward until his weight was on his palms and his head was between his shoulders and the muscles in his neck stood out like cables. He stayed like that for 10 seconds, 20, 30. Then he straightened up. "Get Roach," he said. "Nobody else. Bring him here." Wire left. 3 minutes later, Roach came through the garage door, still carrying the shotgun, still wearing the same expression he'd worn for 3 days. Alert, controlled, ready. He saw Graves' face and the expression shifted. Not much. A degree. The way a compass needle shifts when the magnetic field changes. "Close the door," Graves said. Roach closed it. Graves told him everything. The burner phone, the call to Sills, the encrypted emails, the wire transfer. He laid it out the way you lay out evidence, piece by piece, connection by connection. And when he was done, Roach stood in the middle of the garage with his head tilted slightly to the left, the way it always tilted when he was processing something that was about to change the way he moved through the world. "Where's the burner now?" Roach said. "My pocket." "Does Deacon know it's missing?" "Not yet. He hasn't gone to his bike." "When did you take it?" "Last night, 1 a.m. Roach looked at him. "You've been holding this for 18 hours. "Yeah." "And you didn't put him on the ground?" "No." Roach exhaled through his nose, a long, slow exhale that carried more respect than any words could have. "What do you want to do?" "I want to hear it from him, face to face, in this garage, with you standing behind me in case I can't stop myself." "Graves, I mean it. If I lose control, you put me down. Whatever it takes. I can't kill my own VP, Roach. Not because he doesn't deserve it. Because that girl in the house deserves a protector who still has clean hands." Roach set the shotgun against the wall. He crossed his arms. He looked at Graves with the unblinking stare of a man who has made and kept 10,000 promises and understands that this one weighs more than all the others combined. "I'll hold you," he said. "Go get him." Graves walked out of the garage and across the yard. Deacon was on the front porch, sitting in a folding chair, sharpening a knife with slow, rhythmic strokes against a whetstone. The sound was meditative. Shh, shh, shh. And Deacon's face was calm, focused, the face of a man at peace with his work. "Diak." "Yeah." "Garage. Now." Deacon looked up, read Graves' face. The knife stopped moving. "Everything okay?" "Garage." Deacon set the knife and whetstone on the porch railing. He stood. He followed Graves across the yard, and his stride was the same easy stride it had always been. But something in the back of his neck had changed, a tightening, a slight forward tilt of the head, the body's first unconscious response to the recognition that it is walking toward danger. The garage door closed behind them. Deacon saw Roach standing against the far wall, arms crossed, face empty. He saw the laptop on the workbench, still open. He saw the manila envelope. And he saw Graves standing in the center of the concrete floor, holding the burner phone. Something in Deacon's chest collapsed. You could see it happen. Not a physical collapse, but something behind the eyes. A structure giving way, like a building losing its central support beam. The easy posture dissolved. The calm face cracked. And what was left underneath was something Graves had never seen on his VP's face in 18 years of brotherhood. Shame. "How long have you known?" Deacon said. His voice was stripped. No inflection, no defense. The voice of a man who has been waiting for the floor to drop and is almost relieved to finally feel it go. 20 hours, Graves said. 20 hours. Deacon closed his eyes, opened them. "And you didn't—" "No, I didn't." "Why?" "Because I wanted to hear it from you, not from a phone log, not from Wire's laptop, from your mouth. You owe me that." Deacon's prosthetic hand clicked. A nervous tick, the mechanism adjusting to the tension in the muscles above it, the phantom signals of a hand that no longer existed trying to clench. "Sit down," Graves said. Deacon sat. On the floor. Not on a chair, not on the workbench. On the cold concrete, like a man who understood that he didn't deserve to be comfortable right now. Graves stayed standing. He held the burner phone up. "You called Sills 6 times in 3 months. You emailed him 14 times 6 months ago. You went to his office, and you received a wire transfer of $60,000. I want to know why." The number landed, 60,000. The same number Sills had paid Grace Holloway. Deacon's head dropped. "It wasn't about you," Deacon said. Then what was it about? It was about me. He lifted his head. His eyes were wet. Not crying. Wet. The lubrication of eyes that were fighting to stay open against an overwhelming urge to shut out the world. 6 months ago, Sills contacted me. He said he had information about my disability claim, my VA claim. The one I've been fighting for 9 years. Graves didn't move. He said the county medical examiner who evaluated my injury, the one who downgraded my disability from 70% to 40%, was on Grinnell's payroll, had been for years. Sills said he could get the evaluation overturned, get me the benefits I've been denied, the back pay, all of it. $140,000, Graves, 9 years of money they owed me. In exchange for what? Deacon's jaw tightened. His prosthetic clicked again. Information about the club. Nothing operational. He said he didn't care about our business. He wanted to know our structure, our weaknesses. How many members, who was loyal, who might be turned. He said Grinnell was planning a major development push in the county and wanted to know if the Saints would be a problem. And you told him. I told him some things, surface level, nothing that could hurt us. I swear to you, Graves, I never, or you told a man who killed my daughter about the inside of my club. The words hit Deacon like a physical force. He flinched, actually flinched, the way a man flinches when he's struck, his shoulders pulling in and his head dropping and his whole body contracting around the point of impact. I didn't know, Deacon whispered. I didn't know about Lily. I didn't know Grinnell was connected to the accident. I didn't know any of it until you told us in this garage 2 days ago. And when you told us, when I heard what he did, his voice broke, cracked in half like a stick. I wanted to tell you, I've been trying to find the words for 2 days. I haven't slept. I can't eat. Every time I look at you, I see a man I betrayed, and I don't stop. Deacon stopped. Graves stood over him. The single bulb swung. Shadows moved across both their faces. The 60,000. What was it for? A signing fee. Sills called it a retainer. He said it was standard for consultants. I knew what it really was. I knew I was being bought. But I'd been fighting the VA for 9 years, Graves. 9 years of appeals and denials and being told my hand that I left in a desert on the other side of the world, wasn't worth what they promised me. I was drowning. And Sills threw me a rope. A rope with a noose on the other end. Deacon said nothing. There was nothing to say. Graves turned away. He walked to the workbench. He put both hands flat on the surface and leaned forward and breathed. The 4-7-8 pattern, the leash, the only thing between him and the impulse to destroy the man sitting on the floor behind him. Roach hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. He stood against the wall like a statue, arms crossed, watching with the focused stillness of a man who understood that his job right now was not to intervene, but to be ready to. Did Sills ever mention Lily? Graves said without turning around. Never. Not once. Did he ever mention the Route 17 accident? No. Did he ever ask about me specifically? Silence. Deacon. Yes. The word came out like something torn from living tissue. He asked about your mental state, whether you were stable, whether you had episodes, whether the club was worried about your judgment. Graves closed his eyes. And what did you tell him? I told him you were the strongest man I'd ever known. I told him the club would follow you into fire. I told him if he ever came at you directly, he'd lose. That's what I told him, Graves. Whatever else I did, whatever I sold, I never sold you short. The garage was silent for a long time. Then Graves's phone rang. He pulled it from his pocket. The screen showed Lena's name. He answered. Graves, listen to me. Her voice was different, sharp. The voice of a woman who is not calling to report but to warn. Grinnell filed an emergency injunction 30 minutes ago. He's petitioning the county to condemn the Rayner property as a public health hazard, citing the gasoline contamination from 2 nights ago. His own men put that gasoline there, and now he's using it as grounds for demolition. The hearing is tomorrow morning at 9. If the county approves it, the sheriff has authority to clear the property by force. How much time do we have? 14 hours. And Graves, that's not the worst part. I pulled the judge assigned to the case. It's Harold Pemberton. He's taken campaign contributions from Grinnell for the last 4 election cycles. This isn't a hearing, it's a formality. Grinnell already knows the outcome. Graves looked at the garage, at the laptop with Grinnell's maintenance records, at the manila envelope with the nurse's photographs, at Deacon sitting on the floor with his head in his hands. Then we don't fight it in court, Graves said. What do you mean? I mean we bring the evidence to the hearing, all of it. The truck records, the brake inspection, the nurse's intake report, the wire transfers, everything. We don't argue about a house. We argue about a murder. Lena was quiet for 3 seconds. That's a bomb, Graves. You set that off in a courtroom, it won't just take down Grinnell. It'll take down Sills. It'll take down the county officials who helped bury the accident report. It'll take down anyone who touched this, and some of those people have the power to make your life and the lives of every member of your club very, very difficult. I know. And Deacon. If the wire transfers come out, Deacon goes down too. Graves looked at Deacon. Deacon looked back. And in that look, across the gulf of betrayal and shame and 18 years of brotherhood that were now cracked but not yet broken, something passed between them that neither would ever be able to articulate. It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was the recognition that 2 men can be standing in the wreckage of trust and still choose to face the same direction. Deacon goes on the record, Graves said. He testifies. He tells the court exactly what Sills paid him for and why. Full disclosure. No cover. Deacon stood up from the concrete floor. His eyes were red. His prosthetic hand was still clicking, but his spine was straight. I'll do it, Deacon said. Whatever it costs. I'll do it. Graves turned back to the phone. Lena, I need you to compile everything. Wire's records, Bishop's financial trails, Tank's sealed documents, the nurse's testimony, Deacon's statement. I need it organized, documented, and ready to present in a courtroom in 14 hours. Graves, can you do it? I can do it if I don't sleep. Then don't sleep. He hung up. The next 12 hours were the longest of Graves Mercer's life. Longer than the 9 days in the hospital, longer than the 11 months sleeping in his truck, longer than any night in any war zone in any country whose name he'd been ordered to forget. The Iron Saints mobilized, not with engines and leather and the rolling thunder of Harleys on asphalt, with paper, with laptops, with phone calls made from Evelyn Rayner's kitchen table at 3 in the morning while the old woman slept and her granddaughter sat on the floor beside the couch, wrapped in Graves' road jacket, watching the adults work with the silent, absorbing focus of a child who understands that something important is happening, even if she can't name what it is. Wire-printed documents on a portable printer he'd pulled from his saddlebag. Bishop organized financial records into chronological order, his accountant's mind turning chaos into columns. Tank arrived at midnight with a flash drive containing the sealed accident reconstruction analysis, the one that proved the collision was a side impact, not a head-on, and his face when he handed it over carried the expression of a man who had just committed a felony and would do it again without hesitation. Lena arrived at 2 a.m. She came in a dented gray Honda that looked like it had been through 3 owners, and none of them had been kind. She was taller than Graves remembered, or maybe he was shorter, 3 years and a lot of road between them. And her face had new lines around the eyes that made her look not older, but more precise, like a blade that had been sharpened past the point of aesthetics into pure function. The 2 missing fingers on her left hand were hidden in a leather glove she never took off. She walked into the kitchen, set a bag of files on the table, and looked at Graves for 3 full seconds without speaking. Then she said, "You look terrible." And he said, "You look the same." And something between them that had been frozen for 3 years cracked by 1 degree. Not thawed, not healed, just cracked enough to let light through. They worked. Side by side at the kitchen table, organizing evidence, building a narrative, preparing a presentation that would turn a routine property hearing into the exposure of a conspiracy that reached from a broken truck on Route 17 to a glass tower in Tucson, to the chambers of a county judge who had been bought and paid for before the gavel ever fell. At 6 a.m., Graves stepped onto the porch. Dawn was coming. The sky going pale at the eastern edge, the stars fading, the desert emerging from darkness in layers of gray and gold. The Harleys lined the curb. Roach sat in his folding chair, awake, alert, watching the street. "It's time," Graves said. Roach stood. He looked at Graves, at the exhaustion in his face, the red in his eyes, the rigid line of his jaw, and he saw something he had seen only once before, on a night 12 years ago, when the club had buried a brother, and Graves had stood at the graveside and made a promise that had kept the Iron Saints together through every storm since. "Whatever happens in that courtroom," Roach said, "we're behind you. I know. All of us." He paused. "Even Deacon." Graves said nothing for a moment. Then he nodded. "Even Deacon." The convoy formed at 7. 11 Harleys, the club truck, and Lena's dented Honda. Every patched member of the Iron Saints, plus Lena, plus a retired nurse named Grace Holloway, whom Tank had driven from Mesa overnight and who sat in the passenger seat of the truck with a folder of documents in her lap and the expression of a woman who had waited 3 years to say what she was about to say. They rode through Hardin in the early morning light, engines shaking the quiet streets awake, and people came to their windows and watched them pass. 11 motorcycles in staggered formation, chrome catching the sunrise, leather and steel and the sound of something that had been gathering force in the dark and was now moving into the open. At the courthouse, they parked in a row along the front curb. The building was a 2-story sandstone structure with columns and a flag, and the particular architecture of small-town authority, designed to look bigger than it was, to project power it didn't entirely possess. Grinnell's attorney, Denton Sills, was already inside. His Mercedes was in the reserved lot. 2 black SUVs with tinted windows were parked beside it. Grinnell's private security. Ex-military, licensed. The kind of men who carried their weapons legally and their consciences loosely. Graves killed his engine. He sat on his Harley for a moment, looking at the courthouse, and then he reached into his cut and pulled out 2 things. The manila envelope with the evidence that would end Wade Grinnell's career, his freedom, and possibly his life. And the crumpled dollar bill that a 13-year-old girl had taped to his gas tank 3 nights ago. He put the dollar in his shirt pocket, over his heart. He put the envelope under his arm. He walked toward the courthouse steps, and behind him 10 bikers fell into formation. Not the staggered V of a highway ride, but the tight shoulder-to-shoulder line of men walking into a place where the fight would not be won with fists or engines, but with the one weapon none of them had ever been trained to use. The truth. The courthouse doors opened, and standing in the lobby, flanked by 2 security men in black suits, was Wade Grinnell. He was thinner than Graves had imagined, sharper. His suit was gray, his tie was blue, and his face had the polished synthetic quality of a man who has spent his entire life arranging the world to reflect back the version of himself he prefers. He looked at Graves the way you look at an obstacle, not with fear, not with anger, but with the flat, calculating assessment of a man who is already 3 moves ahead and knows it. Beside him, Denton Sills stood with a leather briefcase and the expression of a man who has never lost a case and does not intend to start today. Graves stopped 10 feet from them. The bikers spread out behind him, filling the lobby with leather and silence. Grinnell looked at the Iron Saints, counted them, measured them. Then he looked at Graves and smiled, a small, controlled smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "I was hoping you'd come." "I bet you were. I want you to know that what happens in that courtroom today isn't personal. It's business. The Rayner property is one piece of a development that will bring jobs, housing, and economic growth to this county. I'm sorry it's inconvenient for you, but progress doesn't wait for sentiment." Graves reached into his shirt pocket. He pulled out the crumpled dollar bill and held it up between 2 fingers. "You see this? A kid paid me this to protect her grandmother. That's sentiment. What you did to my daughter, that's something else." The smile disappeared from Grinnell's face. Not slowly, instantly, like a light being switched off. "Excuse me? October 17th, 3 years ago, Route 17. Truck number GDG117. Brake pads at 1.2 millimeters. Your signature on the service override. My daughter's car hit from the side at 53 miles an hour." The lobby went silent. The security men shifted. Sills' hand tightened on his briefcase. Grinnell's face did something Graves would remember for the rest of his life. It didn't collapse. It didn't crack. It rearranged, the muscles around his eyes contracting, the jaw setting, the nostrils flaring by a millimeter. And what emerged was not the face of a man caught in a lie, but the face of a man recalculating the cost of a truth he thought he'd already paid to bury. "I don't know what you're talking about," Grinnell said, but his voice had changed, a half-tone higher, a fraction less smooth, the voice of a man whose script has just been taken away. Graves held up the manila envelope. "In 20 minutes, a judge is going to hear your petition to condemn an old woman's house. And I'm going to walk into that courtroom and show him what's in this envelope. Maintenance records, intake photographs, a sealed accident reconstruction, wire transfers, and the testimony of a nurse you paid $60,000 to shut up." He stepped closer, close enough to see the sweat forming at Grinnell's hairline. "You wanted to talk about business? Here's business. You can walk into that courtroom and try to take that house. And I will burn your entire empire to ash in front of a judge, a court reporter, and every journalist Lena Vasic called this morning. Or you can walk out of this building right now, drop every claim on the Rainier property, and pray that what I have in this envelope never sees the inside of a prosecutor's office." Grinnell looked at Sills. Sills' face was the color of old chalk. "This is extortion," Sills said. "No," Graves said. "Extortion is what you did to Grace Holloway. This is a choice." The lobby held its breath. And then Grinnell did something nobody expected. He laughed, a short, cold sound that echoed off the sandstone walls like a stone dropping into a well. "You think this scares me?" he said. "You think a pile of papers and a motorcycle gang changes anything? I built this county. I own the permits office. I own the zoning board. I own 3 seats on the county commission. And he looked at his watch. 17 minutes. I'm going to own that block, that house, and every piece of dirt your little crusade is standing on." He leaned forward, close enough for Graves to smell his cologne, close enough for his voice to drop to a whisper. "And I know about Deacon, Mr. Mercer. I know he's compromised. I know everything he told Sills. And I know that the moment you put that envelope on a judge's desk, your own VP's involvement becomes public record. How do you think your brotherhood survives that?" Graves didn't blink. "It survives," he said, "because Deacon's going to be the one who puts it there." Grinnell's smile died for the second time. Behind Graves, Deacon stepped forward. In his one good hand, he held a folder, his own statement, typed at Evelyn's kitchen table at 4 a.m, signed, dated, and witnessed by Roach. "My name is James Bowen," Deacon said. His voice shook, his prosthetic clicked, and he looked Wade Grinnell in the eye with the expression of a man who has been drowning for 6 months and has just decided to stop. "And I'm ready to testify." The courtroom doors opened from inside. The bailiff stepped out. "Grinnell versus Rayner. All parties, please enter." Graves looked at Grinnell. Grinnell looked at the envelope, at Deacon, at the line of bikers behind them, and for the first time something moved behind his carefully constructed face that was not strategy, not calculation, not the smooth machinery of a man who controls outcomes. It was fear. Graves turned toward the courtroom, and then his phone rang. He almost didn't answer. He was 10 steps from a door that would change everything, but the number on the screen was Koa's, and Koa was on watch at the Yellow House, and Koa never called during a shift unless— "Graves." Koa's voice was wrong, tight, the voice of a man pressing words through a clenched jaw. "They're here. 6 vehicles, armed. They're surrounding the house." The blood left Graves' face. "Ivy?" he said. "She's inside with Evelyn. I've got the doors locked, but Graves, there's a dozen of them. Private security, body armor. They've got a county sheriff's deputy with them carrying a demolition order." "That order isn't valid. The hearing hasn't—" "They don't care. They're moving on the house now." Graves stood in the courthouse lobby with the envelope in one hand and his phone in the other, and the world split in two. The courtroom was behind him. Inside it was a judge, a hearing, and the chance to destroy Grinnell legally, permanently, with evidence and testimony and the slow, grinding machinery of justice. The Yellow House was 12 miles away. Inside it was a 13-year-old girl who had trusted him with a dollar bill and a desperate note, and she was surrounded by armed men, and the only thing between her and everything she feared was a single Samoan biker with a shotgun and a folding chair. He couldn't be in both places. He looked at Deacon, at Roach, at the line of saints behind him, at the courtroom door, at the crumpled dollar bill in his shirt pocket. "Deacon," he said, and his voice was the voice of a man making a choice he cannot unmake. "Take the envelope. Take Grace. Take Lena. Walk into that courtroom and burn Grinnell to the ground. Graves, where are you?" But Graves was already moving, already running, through the lobby, past the columns, down the courthouse steps into the morning sun, where his Harley waited at the curb like a promise he'd made to a girl 3 nights ago in the rain. He kicked the engine alive. The sound shattered the quiet morning like a bone breaking. Behind him, Roach was already on his bike, and Tank, and Piston, and 3 others who had read the situation before it was spoken and were mounting up before Graves' engine had finished its first revolution. 6 Harleys tore out of the courthouse parking lot heading east, toward Hardin, toward Mesa Road, toward a yellow house with a blue porch where a child was waiting. And in the courthouse lobby, Deacon stood holding the envelope that contained the truth about Lily Mercer's death, watching the courtroom doors, knowing that what happened in the next hour would either save everything or end it. He walked in. 12 miles never felt so long. Graves opened the throttle past 90 on Route 9, and the desert blurred into a brown smear on both sides of the highway, the wind tearing at his face through the cracked visor, his bad knees screaming against the vibration of the engine, and none of it mattered. Not the speed, not the pain, not the 6 Harleys behind him matching his pace like a formation of low-flying aircraft. What mattered was 12 miles of asphalt between him and a yellow house where a 13-year-old girl was surrounded by armed men, and every second on this highway was a second he wasn't standing between her and whatever was about to happen. His phone was wedged between his thigh and the gas tank, speaker on, Koa's voice coming through in fragments over the wind and engine noise. They're at the fence line. The deputy is reading something, some kind of order. I told him the hearing hasn't happened yet. He doesn't care. Graves, they've got a battering ram. They're going to breach the front door. How long? Minutes, maybe less. Is Ivy safe? She's in the back bedroom with Evelyn. I barricaded the hallway door, but this house is old wood and drywall, Graves. The barricade won't hold. I'm 7 minutes out. Make it 5. Graves dropped his chin and opened the throttle until the speedometer needle hit a place it hadn't been in years. The Harley screamed beneath him. The engine pushed past its comfortable range into that high, tearing register that sounds like metal being pulled apart. Behind him, Roach matched the speed without hesitation. Tank, Piston, and the others fell in tight, the 6-bike formation cutting through the morning air like a blade. 5 minutes. 300 seconds. He counted them the way Ivy had counted her heartbeats behind the dumpster 3 nights ago. Not because counting helped, but because it was the only thing his mind could do that wasn't imagining the worst. At the 4-minute mark, he saw the turnoff for Mesa rump the road. He didn't brake. He leaned the Harley into the turn at 70 miles an hour and felt the rear tire skip once on loose gravel, then catch, and the bike straightened and the yellow house appeared at the end of the road like something from a recurring dream. The same chain-link fence, the same blue porch, the same dead rose bushes that Ray Rayner never got around to pulling up. But now there were 6 vehicles parked on the street, 3 black SUVs, 2 White County vans. 1 sheriff's cruiser with its lights flashing red and blue in the morning sun. 12 men were on the property, 8 in body armor with private security stenciled across their backs. 2 in county uniforms, 1 holding a battering ram at the base of the porch steps, and 1 standing apart from the rest in a suit that cost more than Evelyn Reiner's annual income. Denton Sills. He was here. Not at the courthouse, here, which meant he'd sent Grinnell to the hearing as a decoy, a distraction to draw the saints to the courtroom while the real operation happened at the house. It was elegant in its cruelty. The kind of strategy that a man builds when he's had 3 years of practice burying things. Sills saw the Harleys coming down Mesa Road. His face changed, not with fear, but with the cold recalculation of a man whose timeline has just been compressed. He turned to the deputy. "Execute the order, now!" The deputy hesitated. He was young, maybe 30, with the uncertain face of a man who'd taken this job because it came with a pension, Not because he'd ever imagined himself standing on an old woman's lawn at 8 in the morning, ordering armed men to break down her door. Sir, I'm not sure the order is. It's signed by Judge Pemberton. It's valid. Execute it. The deputy looked at the approaching motorcycles, looked at the battering ram, looked at the house. Execute it now, deputy, or I'll have your badge by noon. The man with the battering ram stepped onto the porch. And then the street began to shake. 6 Harleys hit Mesa Road at 60 miles an hour, and the sound was different than 3 nights ago. Not the rolling thunder of a convoy arriving, but the sharp, compressed roar of men arriving too late and knowing it and refusing to accept it. The bikes didn't park. They mounted the curb, crossed the sidewalk, and pulled directly onto the lawn, engines still running, filling the space between the security team and the house with 600-pound machines and the men who rode them. Graves was off his bike before it fully stopped. He let it drop, just released his grip and let the Harley fall onto its side in the grass, something he had never done in 30 years of riding, and the sound of it hitting the ground was like a door being slammed on everything that didn't matter. He walked through the security line, not around it, through it. 2 men in body armor moved to intercept him, and he walked between them like they were furniture, his eyes locked on the man with the battering ram who was now standing on the porch with the tool raised and his arms trembling, not from the weight of it, but from the sudden animal awareness that the situation had changed. Put it down, Graves said. The man looked at Sills. Sills nodded. The man swung. The battering ram hit the front door, and the old wood splintered inward with a sound like a gunshot, and Graves felt something tear inside his chest. Not muscle, not tissue, but something structural, something that had been holding the architecture of his restraint together for 3 days. And it gave way. He caught the battering ram on the backswing. Both hands, full grip. The man holding it didn't let go fast enough, and Graves pulled him forward off the porch, with the ram still in his hands, and the man's boots left the wooden planks, and he hit the grass on his back with a sound that emptied his lungs. Graves dropped the ram. He turned to face the porch. The door was broken. Through the gap, he could see the hallway. The barricade Koa had built, a bookshelf, a dresser, 2 chairs stacked sideways, was still intact at the far end, blocking the path to the back bedroom. And behind it, barely visible in the dim hallway, was Koa's face, bleeding, a cut above his left eye, deep enough that blood ran down into his eyelashes, and he was bracing the barricade with his shoulder and both arms and every pound of his considerable weight, and his face had the expression of a man who will die in this hallway before he lets anyone through. Koa. Still here, Prez. Are they okay? They're okay. Evelyn's sitting on the bed. Ivy's beside her. The kid hasn't made a sound. Graves turned back to the lawn. Roach had positioned himself between the security team and the porch steps. Shotgun held low but visible. The barrel angled at the ground in a way that was technically non-threatening and practically a promise. Tank stood beside him, his former deputy posture radiating the particular authority of a man who knows exactly how law enforcement works and is prepared to use that knowledge in ways the current deputy had not anticipated. This operation is illegal, Tank said to the deputy. His voice was calm, professional. The voice of a man who has given briefings to rooms full of armed officers and knows how to control a situation with tone alone. The demolition order you're carrying was issued before the hearing. That hearing is happening right now, at the county courthouse, and the evidence being presented will invalidate every order Grinnell has filed in this county for the last 3 years. If you proceed, you are personally liable for destruction of property under an unlawful order. That means your badge, your pension, and about 6 years in a state facility where former law enforcement does not have a good time. The deputy's face went white. I was told the hearing was canceled, he said. You were told wrong. The deputy looked at Sills. Sills's face had undergone a transformation in the last 90 seconds. The smooth, controlled surface cracking in real time, the way a frozen lake cracks when something heavy steps onto it. He was calculating, rapidly, running scenarios the way men like him always do, searching for the angle, the exit, the narrative that puts him on the right side of whatever comes next. Deputy, I assure you the order is, show me, the deputy said. Show me the judge's signature with today's date. Sills opened his mouth, closed it. The order he was carrying had been signed yesterday, pre-signed, by a judge who had agreed to approve the hearing's outcome before the hearing occurred. But the hearing was still in progress, which meant the order was technically premature, which meant the deputy was right, which meant, "Stand down," the deputy said into his radio. "All units stand down, we're leaving." The security team hesitated. They looked at Sills. Sills said nothing. His jaw was clenched so tight the tendons in his neck stood out like cords. "I said stand down," the deputy repeated, and this time there was iron in his voice. The iron of a man who has just realized he was being used and is not pleased about it. The security team lowered their positions. One by one, they withdrew from the property, walking back to the SUVs with the stiff mechanical gait of men who are trained to follow orders and have just received one they didn't expect. The county vans pulled away. The sheriff's cruiser turned off its lights. Sills was the last to move. He stood on the lawn in his expensive suit, surrounded by motorcycle-scarred grass and the lingering rumble of Harley engines, and he looked at Graves with an expression that was not defeat, not yet, but the beginning of the slow structural collapse that happens when a man whose entire career is built on control realizes he has lost it. "This isn't over," Sills said. "Yeah," Graves said. "It is." Sills walked to his car, got in, pulled away. The tires left tracks in Evelyn's lawn, and then the street was quiet. Graves stood on the damaged porch, one hand on the broken door frame, breathing. The adrenaline was leaving his body in waves, and each wave took something with it: strength, focus, the cold operational clarity that had kept him moving for the last 4 days. And what it left behind was exhaustion so deep it felt geological, like something that had been accumulating beneath the surface for years and was only now being allowed to rise. He pushed the broken door open and walked down the hallway. Koa stepped aside from the barricade, blood still running from the cut above his eye, and Graves put a hand on the big man's shoulder and held it there for 3 seconds without speaking, because some things are better said with pressure than with words. He moved the dresser, the chairs, the bookshelf. The back bedroom door was closed. He knocked, gently, with the same scarred knuckles that had caught a battering ram 60 seconds ago. "Ivy, it's Graves. You can open the door." Silence. Then the sound of small feet on carpet. The lock clicked. The door opened. Ivy stood in the doorway wearing his road jacket, which she hadn't taken off in 3 days. Behind her, Evelyn sat on the bed with her hands in her lap, the same posture she'd held on the rocking chair the night the gasoline men came, upright, still, trembling, the posture of a woman who has survived by sitting very still and waiting for the storm to pass. Ivy looked up at Graves. Her eyes were dry. She hadn't cried. Not during the barricade. Not during the battering ram. Not during any of it. She had sat in the dark bedroom with her grandmother and listened to the sounds of her world being broken apart and held together simultaneously. And she had not cried, because Ivy Rayner had learned a long time ago that crying uses energy that could be spent on surviving. But now she looked at Graves, and something in his face, the exhaustion, the relief, the crack in the armor that he couldn't quite close fast enough, broke through whatever wall she'd built, and her chin trembled, and her eyes filled, and she stepped forward and pressed her face against his chest, and the road jacket wrapped around both of them like a tent collapsing. Graves held her. He put one hand on the back of her head the way Evelyn had done 3 nights ago, and he held her while she shook, and he said nothing, because the man who had failed to save his own daughter was standing in a small bedroom in a yellow house, holding a child who was alive because he had chosen to ride 12 miles instead of walk into a courtroom, and the weight of that choice, the rightness of it, the cost of it, the terrible simplicity of it, was more than language could carry. Behind them, Evelyn stood up from the bed. She walked to the doorway on unsteady legs and looked at the broken hallway and the splintered front door and the men in leather standing in her yard. And then she looked at Graves, and she said the same 3 words she'd said 3 nights ago, but this time they sounded different, heavier, completed. "Thank you, son." Graves nodded. He couldn't speak. He was holding a 13-year-old girl and trying very hard not to fall apart, and the effort of both things simultaneously had taken every piece of him that was left. The call from Deacon came at 9:47 a.m. Graves took it on the porch, sitting on the step where he'd sat the first night, smoking a cigarette that Roach had given him because his own pack was empty. The morning was warm now. The sun had climbed high enough to burn off the last of the storm's humidity, and the air smelled like desert sage and wet concrete, and the faint, fading trace of gasoline that might never fully leave this porch. "It's done," Deacon said. His voice sounded like a man who'd been through a fire and come out the other side missing something he'd never get back. Hoarse, raw, but steady. "Tell me." Grace testified first. She showed the intake photographs, the injury assessment, the original report before Sills amended it. The judge, Pemberton, tried to shut it down, called it irrelevant to the property hearing. Lena stood up and entered a formal objection, citing the connection between Grinnell's corporate negligence and the fraudulent condemnation order. Pemberton overruled her. So Lena pulled out her phone and showed him the article she'd already filed with the Arizona Republic, naming Pemberton as a recipient of Grinnell's campaign contributions and detailing the pre-signed demolition order. Graves exhaled smoke. Pemberton recused himself on the spot, called a recess. The clerk contacted Judge Adele Montoya from the neighboring district to take over the hearing. Montoya came in, reviewed the evidence, and Deacon paused. His voice cracked. "Graves, she dismissed the condemnation petition, all of it, and she issued a referral to the State Attorney General's office for investigation into Grinnell Development Group for fraud, evidence tampering, and negligent homicide." The cigarette in Graves's hand burned down to the filter. He didn't notice. "Negligent homicide," he repeated. "For Lily. The AG's office will open a formal investigation. Lena's evidence, Grace's testimony, Wire's maintenance records, Tank's sealed documents, all of it goes to the state. Grinnell will be charged, Graves. Maybe not today, maybe not this month, but it's coming. And Sills is finished." Montoya referred him to the state bar for disbarment proceedings. His license is suspended pending investigation. Graves sat on the porch step and looked at the street. The Harleys. The sun on the chrome. The yellow house behind him, still standing, still alive, held together by blue paint and stubbornness, and the kind of love that doesn't make headlines but keeps the world from collapsing. "And you?" he said. Deacon was quiet for a moment. "I testified. I told them everything. The money, the emails, the information I gave Sills, all of it. Montoya entered it into the record. I'll face charges, Graves, probably obstruction. Maybe conspiracy? I know that. Yeah. I'm not running from it. I know you're not. Graves. Yeah. I'm sorry. I know that word doesn't cover it. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I need you to hear me say it." Graves looked at the cigarette filter between his fingers, crushed it, let the ash fall between the porch boards. "I hear you," he said. And then, after a silence that lasted exactly as long as it needed to, "Come home, Diak." The line went quiet. Then a sound came through the speaker that Graves had never heard from Deacon in 18 years of brotherhood, a short, broken exhale that was not quite a sob but lived in the same neighborhood, the sound of a man who has been holding something so tightly for so long that releasing it doesn't feel like relief but like a kind of small, necessary death. "On my way," Deacon said. The next 3 days moved slowly, the way time moves after a crisis. Thick, syrupy, each hour weighted with the accumulated exhaustion of everything that came before it. The Iron Saints stayed at the Yellow House, not because they were needed for protection anymore. Grinnell's operation had collapsed overnight, his security firm had terminated their contract, and the county sheriff's office had issued a formal apology to Evelyn Rayner that arrived on department letterhead and was written in the particular language of institutions trying to pretend they hadn't failed. But because the house needed work, and the Saints were better at building than they would ever admit. They replaced the front door. Koa and Tank ripped out the splintered frame and hung a new one. Solid oak, heavier than the original, with a deadbolt that Koa installed himself and tested 14 times before he was satisfied. Wire rewired the porch light that had been flickering since before any of them arrived. Dutch patched the drywall in the hallway where the barricade had scraped through the paint. Sable repainted the porch, blue, the same shade, because Evelyn asked her to, and Sable didn't need to be told why. Roach fixed the chain-link fence. He did it alone, early in the morning, with a pair of pliers and a roll of wire, and the methodical patience of a man who understands that small repairs are the foundation of larger ones. When he was done, The fence was straighter than it had been in years, and he stood back and looked at it with the expression of a man who has just completed something that matters more than it appears to. Piston, the youngest member, the one who'd voted no at the first meeting, spent an entire afternoon in Evelyn's backyard, pulling dead rose bushes out of the ground by their roots. He didn't speak while he worked. He just dug and pulled and stacked the dead wood in a pile. And when he was done, he drove to a nursery in town and came back with 6 new bushes, desert roses, the kind that bloom red in the spring, and planted them in the cleared soil without being asked. When Evelyn saw them from the kitchen window, she put her hand over her mouth and stood there for a long time, looking at the yard where her husband had died and where new things were now growing. On the 3rd evening, the work was done. The house was solid. The porch was painted. The roses were planted. And the Iron Saints gathered in Evelyn's kitchen for a meal that Sable and Evelyn had cooked together: fried chicken, cornbread, green beans from a can, and a peach cobbler that Evelyn made from a recipe she'd been carrying in her head since she was 20 years old and had never written down because some things are better kept in memory than on paper. They ate around the kitchen table and on the porch, and standing in the yard, 11 bikers and 1 journalist and 1 retired nurse and 1 old woman and 1 13-year-old girl, and the conversation was not about Grinnell or Sills or courtrooms or the days that had led to this night. It was about motorcycle engines and weather and a fishing trip Koa was planning, and the fact that Roach made the worst coffee any of them had ever tasted and refused to acknowledge it. It was the sound of people being ordinary together after something extraordinary, and it was, in its own rough and imperfect way, the most important sound any of them had heard in a long time. After the meal, as the sun went down and the sky turned the color of copper over the desert, Graves found himself standing at the edge of the yard, alone, looking at the street. Lena came and stood beside him. She didn't say anything for a while. She just stood there, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and the almost was a space that held 3 years of silence and the beginning of something that neither of them was ready to name. "The Republic is running the story tomorrow," she said finally, "front page, above the fold." "Good." Grinnell's assets are being frozen pending investigation. Sill's office was raided this morning. They found records going back 7 years, payoffs, buried reports, falsified inspections. It's not just Lily Graves. There are at least 4 other incidents that Sills covered up. 4 other families who never got the truth. Graves said nothing. He looked at the darkening sky and thought about 4 families sitting in 4 kitchens somewhere, waiting for phone calls they didn't know were coming. Phone calls that would break something and heal something simultaneously, the way truth always does. "Will you be okay?" Lena asked. He looked at her, at the new lines around her eyes, at the leather glove covering the hand that had lost 2 fingers to a story she refused to stop telling, at the woman who had spent 3 years in exile for the crime of caring too much about the truth and had come back the moment he'd asked. "I don't know," he said, "but I'm still here." She nodded. She reached out with her good hand. The right one? The one with all its fingers. And she took his hand, and she held it. Not like a lover, not like a friend, like a person holding the hand of another person in the dark. Because the dark is easier when you're not standing in it alone. They stayed like that until the stars came out. Near midnight, the Iron Saints began to pack up. Saddlebags were loaded, engines were checked. The folding chairs that had served as guard posts for 4 days were collapsed and stowed. The portable printer, the laptops, the tools, the first aid kit, all of it went back into the truck, and the saddlebags, and the particular distributed storage system that a motorcycle club develops over decades of living on the road. Graves stood on the blue porch one last time. The new door was solid behind him. The new porch light burned steady and warm. Through the kitchen window, he could see Evelyn washing the last of the dishes, and beside her Ivy drying them with a towel, and the 2 of them were moving in the synchronized rhythm of people who have shared a kitchen for years and will share it for years more. Ivy came out onto the porch. She was still wearing his road jacket. It still swallowed her. She stood beside him and looked at the line of Harleys along the curb, chrome catching the porch light, engines cooling in the darkness. "You're leaving," she said. "Yeah." "Will you come back?" Graves looked at her, at the brown eyes that had been wide with terror behind a dumpster 3 nights ago and were now steady, clear, and older than any 13-year-old's eyes should be. At the kid who had walked 2 miles through a storm with a dollar bill and a note because the world told her nobody was coming and she went looking for someone anyway. "Every Wednesday," he said, "May's Diner, 9 o'clock. If you ever need us, you walk through that door. You don't need a dollar. You don't need a note. You just walk in and sit down, and every man in that room will know what it means." Ivy looked at the bikers in the yard. At Roach, who was adjusting his mirror and pretending not to listen. At Koa, who had a fresh bandage over his eye and a grin that said the cut was a souvenir he planned to keep. At Deacon, who was sitting on his bike with his head bowed, carrying a weight he would carry for a long time, but carrying it upright. "People are going to say things," Ivy said, "about you, about the club. People at school, people in town. They'll say bikers are criminals. They'll say you're dangerous. Let them." "What do I say back?" Graves reached into his pocket. He pulled out the crumpled dollar bill, the same one she'd taped to his gas tank 3 nights ago, now soft with sweat and rain and the particular wear of something that has been held too tightly for too long. He pressed it into her palm and closed her fingers around it. "You don't say anything," he told her. "You just keep this. And if anybody asks you why you trust a bunch of scarred-up bikers on Harleys, you show them this dollar and you tell them it bought you a family." Ivy looked at the dollar in her hand. Her chin did the thing. The tremble, the fight between breaking down and holding together that she'd been winning and losing in equal measure for 3 days. This time she let it go. Not a collapse, a release. Tears ran down her face in 2 clean lines, and she didn't wipe them, and she didn't look away. She hugged him, fast, fierce, the way she'd hugged Evelyn the first night, with the full-body commitment of a person who has learned that letting go is the most dangerous thing you can do and is choosing to do it anyway. Graves hugged her back. He held on for exactly as long as she needed, and when she pulled away, he let her go. Clean, no lingering, the way you release something you're returning to the world. He walked down the porch steps. He crossed the yard. He picked his Harley up from where it still lay on its side in the grass, the first time he'd dropped a bike in 30 years, and he brushed the dirt off the tank and the seat and the fender with his hands, slowly, carefully, the way you tend to something that has carried you through the worst night of your life. He mounted up. The engine started on the first kick. Behind him, 10 other engines came alive, one by one, filling the quiet street with the sound that Mesa Road would remember for years. Not the sound of danger, not the sound of war, but the sound of something that had arrived when nothing else would and was now leaving because its work was done. The convoy pulled away from the yellow house at 12 minutes past midnight. Ivy stood on the blue porch with her grandmother, the road jacket hanging to her knees and the dollar bill in her fist, and she watched the taillights move down Mesa Road and turn onto Route 9 and disappear into the desert dark, like embers fading at the end of a long fire. Back at the clubhouse, at 1:30 in the morning, the Iron Saints filed into May's Diner and sat in the back booth and ordered coffee that Roach made, and everyone pretended to drink. The room smelled like leather and engine grease, and the particular exhaustion of men who have been awake too long and done too much and are not yet ready to sleep, because sleep means letting go of the thing they just lived through. Graves stood at the memorial wall. It was a section of the clubhouse's back wall covered with photographs, patches, newspaper clippings, and the small artifacts of 30 years of brotherhood. A spent bullet casing, a hospital bracelet, a faded flag from a war nobody talked about. Faces of men who had ridden and fought and bled. And some of them died. And all of them mattered. And all of them were remembered here in this room that smelled like smoke and coffee and something harder to name. He reached into his shirt pocket. He pulled out a photograph, the one from his dashboard, the one he'd flipped face down before Ivy got in the truck 3 nights ago. A little girl, 5 or 6, sitting on the front of a motorcycle, laughing with her whole body, the sun in her hair, and the world still ahead of her. Lily. He pinned the photograph to the wall, right in the center, where everyone who walked in would see it. Then he reached into his other pocket and pulled out a second photograph, one Sable had taken that afternoon on her phone and printed on Wire's portable printer. Ivy, sitting on the porch step, wearing the road jacket, holding a plate of peach cobbler, not quite smiling, but close. Close enough. He pinned it beside Lily's. The two photographs hung side by side on the memorial wall. A daughter lost and a daughter found, separated by 3 years and connected by a dollar bill, and a man who had not believed his hands deserved a second chance, but had been given one anyway by a child who didn't know what she was giving. Graves turned to the room. The Iron Saints were watching him. All of them. Coffee cups in hands. Faces lined with road and weather and the particular kind of beauty that comes from being broken and choosing to keep going. He picked up his coffee. He held it in the air. "To the client," he said quietly. And every biker in the room raised their cup and answered as one. "To the client." The diner fell silent. The coffee was terrible. Outside, the desert stretched in every direction, dark and vast and indifferent. Somewhere on a dead-end street 12 miles east, a 13-year-old girl lay in bed in a yellow house with a blue porch, wearing a leather jacket that smelled like gasoline and tobacco and the strange, unfamiliar scent of safety, holding a crumpled dollar bill against her chest. And for the first time in a very long time, she was not afraid.